I flew across the country with a gift wrapped in heavy gold paper to celebrate my parents' 40th anniversary. Before I could even reach our family table, my mother blocked my path. Her eyes filled with disdain as she announced in front of dozens of guests that I was not invited. When my father eventually pushed my gift off the table, shattering the glass frame inside, he snarled that they did not want anything from my filthy corporate life. I simply smiled, left the broken box on the floor, and walked away. What they did not realize was that the shattered frame held the deed to their $1.5 million estate completely paid off by me. And by throwing it away, they had just handed me the legal right to foreclose on their home and evict them. My name is Kendall, 33 years old, and I am a senior executive at a venture capital and distressed debt firm in Miami. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family members who underestimated your worth and used you as their financial safety net while treating you like garbage. The heavy oak doors of the Boston Country Club swung open, releasing the hum of a string quartet and the clinking of crystal champagne flutes. I stepped into the grand foyer, the gold-wrapped box resting firmly in my hands. The room was dripping in wealth, decorated with towering floral arrangements that I knew cost more than what most people made in a year. I had not been back to Boston in 2 years. I spent my days in Miami ruthlessly analyzing failing companies and restructuring debt, building a life of absolute financial independence. But today was my parents' 40th wedding anniversary, and I had come bearing a gift that was meant to wipe their slate clean. I barely made it past the coat check before the hostility began. My mother Susan materialized from the crowd like a shark sensing blood in the water. She wore a custom emerald green gown, her hair perfectly styled, holding a glass of sparkling wine. The fake polite smile she wore for the country club elite instantly dropped the second she made eye contact with me. She marched over her heels, clicking aggressively against the marble floor, and stood directly in my path. Her eyes darted around to make sure none of her wealthy friends were watching before she lowered her voice into a harsh, venomous whisper. "What are you doing here, Kendall?" she demanded, her gaze sweeping over my tailored black designer suit with clear disapproval. "I told you specifically on the phone last month that we were keeping this an intimate affair. You were not invited." I stood my ground, my posture perfectly straight. "I flew all the way from Miami, Mom. It is a milestone anniversary. I brought a gift." "See," Susan scoffed, crossing her arms. "A gift? Let me guess, another one of your cold, impersonal checks to show off how much money you make ruining people's lives. We do not want your money." Brittany planned this entire evening. She poured her heart and soul into making this a magical night for your father and me. She has been so stressed with her lifestyle influencer brand, yet she still managed to book this entire venue. The last thing she needs is her cynical workaholic older sister showing up to cast a dark cloud over her hard work. Do not ruin this for her, Kendall. Just turn around and leave before you cause a scene. I looked at my mother, absorbing the sheer delusion in her words. Brittany had not paid a single dime for this party. I knew for a fact that the country club required a $30,000 deposit money that Brittany, with her fake internet career, absolutely did not have. But I did not raise my voice. I did not cry. Those days were long gone. "Is that so?" I replied evenly, keeping my tone low and measured. "Brittany planned all of this. That is fascinating, considering her credit cards have been maxed out since April. Did she also plan on telling you that the bank is currently investigating her accounts, or was that a surprise she was saving for dessert?" Susan flinched, her face flushing a deep, angry red. "How dare you speak about your sister that way? She is building an empire. She is creative and passionate, things you know nothing about. You have always been jealous of her, Kendall. Ever since you were little, you could never stand the fact that people naturally loved Brittany. You sit in your glass office in Florida, tearing down companies while your sister brings joy to people. You have no right to come here and spread malicious lies just because you are miserable and alone." Before I could dissect the absolute absurdity of her statement, a loud, booming voice interrupted us. Well, 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 if it isn't the family robot finally leaving her cubicle. I turned to see my brother-in-law, Jamal, swaggering toward us. Jamal was 34, a tall, well-built African-American man who loved to play the part of a wealthy crypto investor. He was dressed in a flashy, obnoxious velvet tuxedo jacket, a massive gold chain resting against his collar, and an oversized diamond stud in his ear. He held a glass of expensive bourbon in one hand and draped his other arm around Susan's shoulders, grinning at me with a look of pure condescension. Jamal was the exact type of man my firm loved to destroy in court. Loud, arrogant, and financially illiterate. Susan cooed, her entire demeanor softening instantly. The transformation was sickening. She treated this con artist with more warmth than she had ever shown her own flesh and blood. I was just telling Kendall that there must have been a miscommunication regarding the guest list. Jamal let out a booming laugh, making sure the guests at the nearby tables could hear him. Yeah, no kidding. This is a VIP event, Kendall. We only invited people who actually know how to celebrate life. No offense, but your whole sad, lonely workaholic vibe really kills the mood. We are popping vintage champagne talking about Web 3.0 and real estate investments. You probably just want to talk about interest rates and depression. Why don't you head back to the airport? I will even send you some Bitcoin to cover your economy ticket back to Florida. A few of the older guests nearby chuckled, looking at me with pity. Jamal smirked, taking a sip of his bourbon, clearly proud of his little performance. He thrived on humiliating me because it made him feel superior, and my parents allowed it because they thought he was a financial genius. They truly believed Jamal was making millions trading cryptocurrency and brokering luxury cars. I let the silence hang for a moment. I looked at Jamal, then looked down at his wrist. The lighting of the chandelier caught the face of his watch. That is a very nice Rolex, Jamal, I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. Is that the platinum day-date model? Jamal puffed out his chest, adjusting his velvet cuffs so the watch was more visible. Good eye. Yeah, dropped 50 grand on it last month. Crypto has been very good to me, Kendall. Maybe if you loosened up and stopped working for the corporate machine, I could teach you a thing or two about real wealth generation. I smiled. A slow, chilling smile that made Susan shift uncomfortably. That is incredibly generous of you, Jamal. But I do not need investment advice from a man who had to borrow $40,000 from my parents' retirement fund last Christmas just to keep his leased Porsche from being repossessed. The smirk vanished from Jamal's face instantly. His eyes widened, and he choked slightly on his bourbon. Susan gasped, her hand flying to her chest. I took a step closer to him, lowering my voice so only the three of us could hear, but keeping my tone sharp enough to cut glass. Did you really think I would not find out? I work in distressed debt, Jamal. It is my literal job to find out who owes money to whom. You did not buy that Rolex with crypto profits. You bought it because you took out a high-interest predatory loan 2 weeks ago, and you are currently drowning in debt. You stand here mocking my career, calling me a lonely workaholic while you play dress-up using my parents' dwindling savings. You are a liar, Jamal hissed, his voice trembling with a mix of rage and panic. He looked frantically at Susan. Do not listen to her, Susan. She is just trying to cause drama. My portfolio is up 300% this quarter. She is just a bitter, jealous woman who cannot stand seeing us succeed. Susan immediately jumped to his defense, glaring at me with absolute hatred. You are a monster, Kendall. To come to our anniversary party and spew such toxic, slanderous accusations. Jamal has been nothing but a wonderful son to us. He actually cares about this family. You just care about numbers. You have completely lost your mind. I am not the one losing my mind, Mom, I replied, my grip tightening on the gold box. But you are about to lose a lot more than that if you do not wake up. Just then my father Richard walked over. He looked red in the face, already several drinks deep and furious that there was a commotion happening in the foyer. What is going on here? He demanded loudly, drawing the attention of the entire room. Why is she here? I thought we agreed we were not dealing with her negativity tonight. I turned to face my father. Richard was a man who cared about exactly two things in life, his exclusive country club membership, and preserving the absolute illusion of his wealth. He stood there glaring at me, his face flushed a deep crimson from the premium scotch in his hand. "Hello, Dad," I said, keeping my voice perfectly steady and devoid of the intimidation he was trying to project. "Happy 40th anniversary. I came to deliver your present, and then I will be out of your way." Before he could respond, a high-pitched gasp echoed from behind him. It was Brittany. My younger sister floated toward us in a custom silk gown that probably cost more than my first car. She had a professional camera crew trailing behind her, capturing every angle of the evening for her lifestyle vlog. The moment she saw me, her perfectly contoured face twisted into a mask of exaggerated distress. She immediately clung to our father's arm, looking up at him with wide, tearful eyes. "Daddy, why is Kendall here?" Brittany whined, making sure her lapel microphone caught the deliberate quiver in her voice. She promised she was not coming. She knows how hard I work to curate the aesthetic for tonight. She is completely ruining the energy. My followers are going to sense the negative tension in the video. "Do not worry, sweetheart." Richard patted her hand soothingly, casting a disgusted look in my direction. "Your sister is just leaving. She knows she does not belong here among people who actually value family over profit margins." I looked at the three of them, my mother with her fake outrage, my father with his unearned arrogance, and my sister playing the eternal victim, while her fraudulent husband Jamal stood by smirking. They were a perfect portrait of toxic delusion. I felt absolutely nothing for them. No anger, no sadness, just a cold, calculating clarity. I stepped forward and walked past them toward the main VIP family table, situated directly in the center of the room. The table was draped in expensive white linen and surrounded by towering centerpieces of imported white roses. I gently placed the heavy gold-wrapped box right in the center of the table next to a crystal ice bucket. "I am not staying," I announced, turning back to face them. "But I strongly suggest you open that box before the night is over. It is the most valuable thing anyone in this room will ever give you. Consider it my final contribution to this family." Richard marched over to the table, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. The veins in his neck were bulging against his starched white collar. He pointed a trembling finger at my face. "We do not want your dirty corporate money, Kendall," he shouted, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. The string quartet abruptly stopped playing. Every single guest in the grand foyer turned to stare at us in dead silence. "You think you can just march in here, insult my son-in-law, upset your sister, and throw your cash in our faces to prove you are better than us?" Richard continued, his volume rising. "We know exactly how you make your living. You tear down hard-working people's businesses and sell off the scraps. You are a vulture. We do not need anything from you." "Dad," I said calmly, maintaining direct eye contact without flinching, "you are going to want to look inside that box." "I do not want to look at anything from you," Richard roared. With a violent sweeping motion of his arm, my father shoved the heavy gold box off the table. It hit the marble floor with a sickening explosive crash. The sound of thick glass shattering reverberated through the silent room. Splinters of glass pierced through the expensive gold wrapping paper, scattering across the polished floor. Some of the older guests gasped and took a collective step back. Jamal let out a low whistle, clearly enjoying the chaos, while Susan crossed her arms looking at the broken box with a smug expression of victory. Brittany hid her face in her hands, pretending to be traumatized for her camera crew. The room was so quiet you could hear the ice melting in the crystal buckets. I stood there for a long moment, looking down at the shattered box on the floor. Through a large tear in the gold paper, a tiny corner of a legal document was visible. It was the deed. The deed I had spent weeks untangling from the commercial bank, the deed I had paid $1.5 million of my own hard-earned money to clear just to save them from becoming homeless. It was the ultimate olive branch, and he had just smashed it to pieces. I looked up from the floor and met my father's furious gaze. I did not yell, I did not cry, I did not try to explain myself. Instead, a slow, genuine smile spread across my face. It was the cold smile of someone who had just won a chess match 5 moves in advance. "You are right, Dad," I said, my voice cutting through the heavy silence like a surgical scalpel. You do not need anything from me. And as of this exact moment, you will never get anything from me again. Enjoy your party." I did not bend down to pick up the box. I turned on my heel and walked toward the grand exit. The crowd parted for me like the Red Sea, wealthy guests, whispering behind their hands and staring in utter shock. I pushed open the heavy oak doors and stepped out into the crisp Boston night air. The valet immediately brought my rental car around to the front steps. As I slid into the luxury leather driver's seat, I pulled my phone from my designer bag and dialed a number I knew by heart. It rang exactly twice before my lead attorney answered. "Good evening, Kendall." His professional voice came through the car speaker system. "Did you give them the deed? Are we closing the file on the Boston residential property?" I started the engine, feeling the powerful purr of the motor vibrating through the steering wheel. "No," I replied, my tone entirely devoid of mercy. "They rejected the gift. In fact, they threw it on the floor." The family intervention was a complete failure. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line as my lawyer processed the information. "I understand. What are your instructions regarding the defaulted mortgage our firm purchased?" I put the car in drive and looked at the glowing windows of the country club in my rearview mirror one last time. "Execute the foreclosure," I ordered firmly. "Fast-track the eviction process. Do not give them a single day of grace beyond the legal minimum. As of tonight, my holding company officially owns that estate, and I want them out of that house by the end of the week." "Understood, Kendall. I will file the paperwork first thing in the morning." I hung up the phone and pressed the accelerator, driving away from the country club and leaving my family behind to dance blindly on the deck of their own sinking ship. I would later learn every pathetic detail of how their perfect evening unraveled after my taillights disappeared down the long, winding driveway of the country club. While I was driving back to the airport with a quiet sense of victory, my family was busy trying to desperately glue their shattered facade back together. Richard immediately tried to save face in front of his wealthy peers. He loudly ordered another round of vintage champagne for the surrounding tables, laughing too aggressively and clapping Jamal on the back to show unity. Susan smoothed her emerald dress, offering apologetic, condescending smiles to her friends, whispering that I was simply having a corporate meltdown and had always struggled with emotional stability. Brittany, true to her narcissistic nature, went right back to filming aesthetic content for her followers, pretending her aura remained completely unbothered by her older sister's outburst. But the shattered glass still lay on the marble floor of the grand foyer, a jagged, undeniable reminder of my visit. Around midnight, as the guests were finishing their espresso and imported chocolate truffles, the illusion finally broke. A young busboy in a crisp white uniform had been tasked with sweeping up the mess I left behind. As he gathered the shards of thick glass into his dustpan, he noticed a folded stack of heavy parchment paper tucked inside the crushed remains of the gold foil box. Assuming it was a financial gift that had been accidentally damaged in the commotion, he placed the torn package on a small silver tray and approached my parents' VIP table. "Excuse me, sir," the young man said politely, interrupting Richard, who was in the middle of a boastful speech about his recent golf handicap. "I was sweeping up the foyer and found this inside the broken frame. It looks like an important document. I did not want it to get thrown out with the trash." Richard snatched the torn package from the silver tray, a smug, arrogant grin returning to his flushed face. He looked at Susan, then at Jamal, shaking his head in mock pity. "Let us see what our cold-hearted daughter considered a peace offering," he sneered loudly, making sure the neighboring tables could hear him. "It is probably a cashier check for $5,000 to alleviate her crushing guilt. She always thought she could buy our affection." Richard forcefully pulled the thick ivory parchment from the torn gold wrapping. It was not a check. There were 3 pages stapled together. The first page was a copy of a commercial mortgage contract, complete with his own signature at the bottom. The second page was a legal transfer of debt assigning the mortgage to K Holdings, LLC, which was my firm. The third page was the official court-stamped Notice of Intent to Foreclose. Richard's eyes scanned the bold black letters at the top of the page. Suddenly, he stopped breathing. The smug, arrogant grin slid off his face as if it had been physically wiped away, replaced by an ashen, sickly pallor. The color drained from his cheeks, leaving him looking hollow and aged. His hands began to shake so violently that the heavy parchment paper rattled loudly in the quiet dining room. He read the total amount due. $1.5 million. He read the creditor name. My name. Susan noticed his sudden, terrifying paralysis. "Richard, what is it?" she asked, her voice laced with sudden anxiety. "Is it a check? How much did she write it for?" Richard could not speak. He just sat there frozen, staring at the bold ink that represented his absolute financial ruin. Jamal, who had been loudly boasting about his cryptocurrency portfolio just moments before, leaned over to peer over my father's shoulder. He wanted to see what had caused the old man to short-circuit. The moment Jamal's eyes locked onto the letterhead of the predatory lending company he had originally used to secretly secure the loan, all the fake untouchable swagger drained out of his body. He stumbled backward away from the table, his foot catching on the leg of his chair. He fell hard, knocking the heavy mahogany chair backward with a loud, echoing clatter that drew sharp gasps from the remaining guests in the room. Richard finally found his voice, though it was nothing more than a hoarse, terrified whisper. "What is this? What did you do, Jamal?" Susan leaned over and grabbed the papers from her husband's violently shaking hands. She read the terrifying legal jargon aloud, her voice rising in pitch and panic with every single syllable. Notice of foreclosure. Defaulted debt. $1.5 million. Richard. What does this mean? We own our house outright. We paid off the mortgage 10 years ago. Look at the signature, Susan! Richard snapped, his booming voice returning, but this time fueled by pure, unadulterated terror. His anger pivoted instantly away from me and locked directly onto his precious son-in-law. "That is not my signature. Someone forged my name and took out a massive mortgage on our estate." Brittany stopped recording her vlog, sensing the actual unscripted panic radiating from our parents. "Daddy, what are you talking about?" she whined, her perfectly contoured face twisting in confusion. "Did Kendall do something illegal? Is she trying to steal the house?" "No," Richard whispered, the crushing weight of reality finally breaking through his lifelong delusion. He looked down at the torn gold paper resting on the white tablecloth. He remembered the exact words I had spoken to him before I walked out. "I came to deliver your present. It is the most valuable thing anyone in this room will ever give you." The epiphany hit him like a physical blow to the chest. "She bought the debt," Richard gasped, his eyes wide with horror as he connected the dots. "She found out about the fraudulent loan. She bought the toxic debt from the bank. That box. The glass frame I smashed. It was not a check, it was the cleared deed. She brought us the deed to the house to save us from foreclosure." Susan let out a horrific, guttural sob, clapping her manicured hands over her mouth. She looked wildly at the exit doors, then back at the torn foreclosure notice in her hands. "We threw it away," she cried hysterically, her perfect country club persona completely disintegrating. "We threw it on the floor and told her we did not want anything from her. We told her to leave." Richard lunged across the table, knocking over a crystal ice bucket, and grabbed Jamal by the lapels of his flashy velvet tuxedo jacket. "You stole from me!" he roared, his voice echoing through the entire club. "You forged my name and put my family home on the line for your garbage crypto investments." Jamal shoved Richard off aggressively, backing away toward the exit like a cornered rat. "Hey man, do not put this all on me," Jamal shouted back, pointing an accusatory finger at his wife. Brittany knew we needed cash to keep up appearances. She knew exactly what I was doing. Brittany shrieked loudly, denying it instantly and bursting into real messy tears. The perfect, highly curated anniversary party had devolved into a vicious, screaming brawl in the middle of the dining room. Security guards had to be called in to physically separate my father and Jamal. The grand illusion of the flawless, wealthy, untouchable family was entirely dead. And I was the one holding the shovel. 30,000 feet above the eastern seaboard, I reclined into the plush, oversized leather seat of my first-class cabin. The ambient lighting of the plane was dimmed to a soothing blue, and a flight attendant had just handed me a perfectly chilled dirty martini in a real glass. I took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the crisp gin burn pleasantly down my throat. down below the lights of the coastline, faded into the dark ocean. My phone, resting on the polished mahogany tray table, began to vibrate frantically, illuminating the cabin with its harsh screen. I glanced at the caller identification. Incoming call from Susan. It had taken them exactly 45 minutes to find the papers. I let the phone vibrate across the tray table, taking another measured sip of my drink, savoring the absolute silence of the cabin before I casually swiped my finger across the screen to accept the call. "Kendall, what is this sick, twisted game you are playing?" My mother shrieked the absolute second the line connected. The background noise bleeding through the speaker was pure, unfiltered chaos. I could hear Richard screaming a string of violent profanities in the distance, and Brittany was sobbing with the loud performative gasps she always used when she wanted attention. It sounded like an active war zone inside that elegant country club dining room. "I assume you finally decided to open the anniversary gift I brought you," I replied evenly, my voice a stark contrast to her hysteria. "This is a cruel, elaborate prank," Susan gasped, her voice trembling but still trying to forcibly inject her usual condescending tone. "You went through all this trouble to fabricate these fake legal documents just because you are so bitterly jealous of your sister. You always have been. You could not stand seeing her host such a beautiful event, so you hired someone to print these horrible lies to ruin her night. Well, congratulations. You successfully caused a scene. Now tell me this is a joke so we can go home and put this horrible evening behind us." Her ability to gaslight me even when staring down the barrel of total financial ruin was truly a psychological marvel. "It is not a prank, Mom," I said, my voice completely devoid of sympathy or warmth. "It is a legally binding notice of intent to foreclose. Do you know what a hard money lender is? It is a predatory lending institution that gives out high-risk commercial loans with astronomical interest rates. Jamal went to one 6 months ago. He forged Dad's signature on the commercial loan agreement and used your estate as collateral. When he predictably defaulted on the payments, the bank prepared to auction the property. My firm K Holdings LLC purchases toxic debt portfolios. We bought that specific debt from the bank. We own the mortgage now. You owe my firm $1.5 million plus accumulated interest and legal fees." Susan let out a strangled, terrified cry. "No. No, that is impossible. Jamal is a millionaire. He trades cryptocurrency. He drives a Porsche. He would never do this to us." I let out a sharp, genuine laugh that echoed slightly in my spacious seating area. "Jamal is a professional con artist who lost every single penny of that loan on worthless digital coins before the market crashed. He leases that Porsche, and he is currently drowning in debt. He has zero assets. And because Dad is legally the guarantor on that forged document, the house belongs to my firm." There was a violent rustling sound over the line as the phone was snatched away. "Listen to me right now, Kendall," Richard demanded, his booming voice coming through the speaker. He was trying to revert to his authoritarian tone, the same tone he used to terrify me when I was a child. "You are going to call your corporate lawyers right now and drop this nonsense. I am your father. I demand you fix this. We will sue you for everything you have if you try to steal my house." I swirled the olive in my glass, watching the liquid catch the dim light. "Sue me with what money, Dad? To hire a commercial litigation attorney in Boston, you need a massive retainer up front. Have you checked your retirement accounts recently? Or did Jamal drain those too to cover his margin calls?" There was a heavy, suffocating silence on the other end of the line. The truth was finally piercing through his titanium ego. "I did not steal your house, Dad," I continued, my tone dropping to a lethal quiet register. "I tried to save it. Inside that gold wrapping paper was a legally binding release of lien. I bought the debt from the bank, and I prepared the legal paperwork to forgive the loan entirely. I paid off the $1.5 million with my own money. I was giving you the house free and clear. All you had to do was accept the gift. Instead, you pushed it off the table, shattered it on the floor, and told me my money was dirty. You told me you wanted nothing from me. I am simply honoring your request." "You are our daughter!" Richard yelled, raw desperation finally cracking his arrogant facade. "You cannot throw us out on the street over a misunderstanding. Jamal tricked us. We are victims here." It was not a misunderstanding, I replied coldly. It was a choice. You chose to humiliate me. You chose to publicly protect a fraud who was actively destroying you. And now you get to live with the consequences of those choices. You have exactly 7 days to vacate the premises. Susan began to wail in the background, a high-pitched, wretched sound of absolute despair. 7 days. Kendall, please, I am begging you. We have nowhere to go. All our liquid assets are tied up. You cannot do this to your family. You are not my family, I stated calmly. You are just tenants who are illegally occupying my property. That is not my concern. The state of Massachusetts requires a minimum notice period after a default has matured. I am giving you the strict legal minimum. If you are not entirely moved out by next Friday, at 8 in the morning, the county sheriff will arrive to physically remove you and change the locks. Do not test me on this. I will not grant a single hour of extension. Kendall, wait, please. Richard begged, his voice breaking into a pathetic sob. We can talk about this. I tapped the red button on my screen, cutting him off mid-sentence. The sudden silence in my headphones was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. I switched my phone to airplane mode, tossing it onto the empty seat beside me. They finally realized I was no longer the punching bag they could discard when inconvenient. I held the executioner's axe, and it had just fallen. I leaned back, closed my eyes, and enjoyed the rest of my flight. While I was floating comfortably above the clouds, sipping sparkling water, the grand estate in Boston was rapidly descending into a war zone. I found out later from the private investigator I hired just how spectacularly the fallout unfolded that night. Richard and Susan had rushed back to the house, dragging Brittany and Jamal with them. The heavy oak doors of the mansion, the very doors my firm now legally owned, slammed shut, trapping the four of them in a pressure cooker of their own making. The house was a monument to their vanity. A sprawling colonial with custom chandeliers, imported Italian marble floors, and walls covered in expensive artwork. It was the house I grew up in, the house where I was constantly reminded I was second best. Now it was the house they were about to lose. Richard did not even bother taking off his tuxedo jacket. He threw the crumpled foreclosure notice onto the massive kitchen island and cornered Jamal. For the first time in his life, my father looked at his golden son-in-law, not with admiration, but with raw, unadulterated rage. He demanded to know exactly how his signature ended up on a commercial mortgage contract from a predatory lending company. Jamal tried to run his usual game. He paced around the kitchen, waving his hands, using big financial buzzwords to confuse them. He claimed it was a temporary liquidity issue, a minor bridge loan to cover a margin call during a cryptocurrency market correction. He spoke fast, trying to bury the crime in corporate jargon. But Richard was a lot of things: an arrogant snob, a terrible father, but he was not completely financially illiterate when his own survival was on the line. He backed Jamal against the stainless steel refrigerator and screamed at him to stop lying. Under the threat of Richard calling the police, Jamal finally cracked. The truth spilled out of him in a pathetic, sweaty confession. He admitted that his massive crypto portfolio was entirely leveraged. When the market crashed 6 months ago, he lost everything in a matter of hours. Desperate to keep up the illusion of his lavish lifestyle, he snuck into Richard's home office during a Sunday dinner, photographed my father's private financial documents, and forged his signature on a hard money loan, using the estate as collateral. He thought he could day trade his way back to millions before the first payment was due. Instead, he lost the borrowed $1.5 million in 3 weeks. Susan collapsed into a leather bar stool, weeping uncontrollably. Her perfect country club mascara ran down her cheeks in thick black lines. She looked at Brittany, waiting for her golden child to condemn the man who had just destroyed their family. She expected Brittany to pack her bags and leave him. But Brittany did what she had been trained to do her entire life. She played the victim, instead of screaming at Jamal. Brittany rushed to his side and wrapped her arms around him, shielding him from our father's rage. She turned her perfectly contoured face toward our parents' tears streaming down her cheeks, and launched into a masterclass of emotional manipulation. "Daddy, please stop yelling at him," Brittany sobbed, her voice trembling with practiced perfection. He was only trying to provide for us. He wanted to double the money so he could buy you and Mom that vacation home in Aspen you always talked about. He made a mistake, but his heart was in the right place. He is family. Richard was stunned. His face turned a deep, dangerous purple. A mistake, he bellowed, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. He committed federal wire fraud and stole our home. He is a criminal. But Brittany did not miss a beat. She immediately pivoted, shifting the target from her criminal husband directly onto me. She knew exactly which psychological buttons to push to activate our parents' deep-seated disdain for my independence. "This is not Jamal's fault," Brittany cried out, pointing a manicured finger at the crumpled foreclosure notice on the counter. "This is Kendall. Do you not see what she is doing? She has been waiting for an opportunity like this her entire life. She is obsessed with ruining my happiness." Susan, desperate for any reality where her favorite daughter was not married to a complete failure, lifted her tear-stained face. "What do you mean, sweetie?" Brittany paced the kitchen floor, spinning a web of pure delusion. "Think about it, Mom. Kendall has millions of dollars. She could have just paid off the loan quietly and told us in private, but she did not. She bought the debt specifically so she could hold it over our heads. She came to my beautiful anniversary party just to publicly humiliate us in front of everyone who matters. She wants to tear this family apart because she is miserable and alone. She set a trap and Jamal fell into it. She is trying to make me homeless because she hates that you love me more." It was a staggering display of mental gymnastics. Jamal had forged documents and stolen millions, but somehow in Brittany's twisted narrative, I was the mastermind villain because I held them accountable. And the truly terrifying part was how quickly my parents swallowed the lie. It was easier to hate the daughter they had always undervalued than to admit their golden child was a fraud. Susan stood up, wiping her eyes, her posture stiffening with renewed misplaced anger. "Brittany is right, Richard. Kendall knew we were vulnerable. She engineered this whole eviction timeline just to punish us. She is a cold, calculating sociopath. She never cared about us." Richard, too weak to face the reality of his own ruin and too cowardly to kick his fraudulent son-in-law out of the house, nodded slowly. He looked at the foreclosure notice, his fear mutating back into arrogance. He refused to be bested by the daughter he had spent 33 years undermining and dismissing. "She thinks she can just kick us out into the street," Richard sneered, slamming his fist on the granite counter so hard the silverware rattled. "She thinks because she has some fancy law firm in Miami that she can bully her own blood. Well, she picked the wrong fight. We are not leaving this house. We will fight her in court. We will expose her predatory business practices to the press. We will show everyone what a monster she really is." Jamal, sensing he was suddenly off the hook, puffed his chest back out, nodding enthusiastically. "Yeah, Richard, I know some people. We can tie this eviction up in litigation for years. She will bleed legal fees until she begs us to settle. We just need to stay united." And just like that, the four of them formed a united front against me. A fortress of delusion built entirely on a foundation of fraud and entitlement. They convinced themselves that they were the righteous victims of an evil, jealous sister. They went to sleep that night believing they could easily outsmart me, fully convinced that their country club privilege would shield them from the law. They had absolutely no idea that I had already anticipated every single one of their moves, and the trap I had set was entirely inescapable. The next morning, the reality of their situation clamped down on them like a steel trap. Richard, operating on zero sleep and still vibrating with misplaced anger, marched into his mahogany-paneled home office to initiate his grand legal counterattack. He logged into his primary banking portal, fully intending to wire a massive retainer to the most aggressive defense attorney in Boston. Instead of his usual six-figure balance, his screen displayed a terrifying red notification. "Account frozen pending fraud investigation." Jamal's reckless forgery had triggered an automatic flag in the banking system. The hard money lender, realizing they had been scammed the moment I purchased the debt and initiated the foreclosure, had reported the fraudulent transfer to the federal authorities. The bank had locked down every single account associated with Richard's Social Security number. His checking, his savings, even his retirement portfolio were entirely inaccessible. Susan tried to use her platinum credit cards to book emergency first-class flights to Miami so they could confront me in person. Every single card she swiped was declined. The country club elite, the couple who sneered at anyone flying economy, suddenly found themselves with less accessible cash than a college student. Panic mutated into sheer desperation. They could not hire a lawyer, they could not buy plane tickets. And the clock on my 7-day eviction notice was loudly ticking down. They had exactly one option left if they wanted to save their sprawling colonial mansion. They had to physically get to Miami and force me to undo the foreclosure. They loaded up Richard's leased luxury SUV and began the agonizing, humiliating 20-hour drive down the East Coast. It was a journey that systematically stripped away every ounce of their manufactured arrogance. They were not used to road trips. They were used to airport lounges and priority boarding. Now they were trapped in a confined space for almost a full day, surviving on greasy gas station food and lukewarm coffee, because they were terrified to spend the meager amount of physical cash they had managed to scrape together from their wallets. The physical toll was immense. Richard, a man who required 8 hours of sleep on a temperature-controlled mattress, was forced to grip the steering wheel through torrential rain in South Carolina, his eyes bloodshot and his back screaming in pain. Susan, accustomed to daily massages and perfect posture, was crumpled in the passenger seat, her designer clothes wrinkled and smelling faintly of stale fast food. Every mile they drove, the tension inside the vehicle thickened. They turned on each other, the stress fracturing their unified front. Susan blamed Richard for not keeping a closer eye on his financial documents. Richard screamed at Susan for coddling Jamal and blinding them to his obvious grift. The illusion of their perfect marriage deteriorated somewhere around the Georgia state line, leaving behind nothing but bitter resentment and raw fear. By the time they crossed into Florida, they were exhausted, filthy, and operating on pure, desperate adrenaline. They had convinced themselves during the long drive that if they could just see me face to face, they could use the sheer weight of parental authority to bend me to their will. They believed that standing in front of me looking pathetic and tired would trigger some deeply buried daughterly guilt that they could exploit. They pulled into the circular driveway of my ultra-luxury high-rise in downtown Miami just as the sun was setting. The building was a towering monolith of glass and steel overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. It was the kind of address that demanded respect, the kind of place Richard and Susan would normally brag about if it belonged to anyone other than the daughter they despised. They stumbled out of the SUV looking like refugees from a country club. Richard's face was covered in gray stubble, his eyes wild and sunken. Susan's hair, usually perfectly coiffed, was completely flat and greasy. They marched up to the heavy glass doors, expecting the world to part for them, just as it always did in Boston. The doorman, dressed in a sharp, tailored suit, stepped gracefully in front of them, politely but firmly blocking their path. "Good evening, sir, ma'am. Can I help you? We are here to see our daughter Kendall." Richard demanded, his voice raspy and cracked from 20 hours of silent seething. "Tell her we are coming up." The doorman did not flinch at Richard's commanding tone. He simply pulled a sleek tablet from his jacket. "I am sorry, sir. Miss Kendall resides in the penthouse, and she requires pre-authorization for all guests. May I have your names so I can call up to her residence?" Richard's face flushed an angry mottled red. "I do not need authorization to see my own daughter. I am Richard, her father. Just let us through the damn doors." "Sir, if you raise your voice again, I will have security escort you off the premises," the doorman replied, his polite tone dropping several degrees. "I will call the penthouse. Please wait here." Richard and Susan were forced to stand outside the glass doors, humiliated, while residents in expensive evening wear walked past them, eyeing their disheveled appearance with clear disdain. The tables had turned completely. They were no longer the gatekeepers of exclusive spaces. They were the unwanted outsiders begging for entry. Up in my penthouse, I was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the city lights flicker to life over the water. I had been tracking the GPS location of Richard's leased SUV for the past 20 hours. I knew exactly when they crossed the county line. I knew exactly when they pulled into the driveway. The intercom on my wall chimed softly. Miss Kendall. The concierge's voice crackled through the speaker. There is a couple down here claiming to be your parents. They are quite agitated and demanding to be let up. I took a slow sip of my wine, savoring the absolute control I held in my hands. Do not let them up, I instructed clearly. Tell them I will be down in exactly 5 minutes. If they try to force their way into the lobby, call the police. I set my glass down on the marble counter. They had driven 20 hours to manipulate me. It was time to show them exactly what happened when you tried to intimidate a woman who held all the cards. I stepped into the private elevator that serviced only the penthouse level. The polished mirrors reflected a woman completely in control. I wore a tailored silk blouse and sharp trousers, my hair perfectly styled. I looked like a chief executive who had just finished a relaxing evening at home. The elevator descended swiftly, the digital numbers dropping until the doors glided open to reveal the expansive marble-floored lobby of my building. The contrast was almost cinematic. There they stood in the center of the pristine lobby, looking like absolute wrecks. Richard was pacing aggressively, his clothes rumpled and stained with coffee, his face a mask of exhausted rage. Susan was slumped on a velvet sofa, looking haggard and terrified. The moment the elevator chimed, Richard locked eyes with me and charged forward, fully expecting me to step aside and invite them up to my sanctuary. Kendall, he barked, his voice echoing loudly in the cavernous space. It is about time. Tell this idiot at the desk to give us a guest key. We are exhausted, and we need to talk to you right now. He reached out to grab my arm, a physical intimidation tactic he had used my entire life to force compliance. I did not step back. I simply raised my hand, my palm flat, signaling him to stop. Do not touch me, I said, my voice low, icy, and entirely unyielding. And do not speak to my concierge that way. You are not guests here. You are trespassers. The head of security, a towering man named Marcus, immediately stepped out from behind the mahogany front desk, positioning himself strategically between my father and me. Richard stopped in his tracks, his eyes darting from the security guard back to me in utter disbelief. Are you out of your mind? Richard shouted, his face turning a dangerous shade of red. We are your parents. We just drove 20 straight hours because your little stunt froze all of our bank accounts. We have no money. We have not slept. You are going to take us up to your apartment right now, and you are going to call off this ridiculous foreclosure. I crossed my arms, looking at him with absolute indifference. I am not taking you anywhere, and I am certainly not calling off the foreclosure. I came down here to tell you to your face what I already told you on the phone. You have less than a week to pack up your belongings. Susan scrambled off the velvet sofa, stumbling toward me with tears streaming down her face. She tried to grab my hands, but I took a deliberate step backward, keeping the security guard between us. Kendall, please. Susan sobbed, her voice cracking. You cannot do this to us. We are family. You have to show some family loyalty. We gave you life. We raised you. You cannot just throw your own mother and father out onto the street. Think about the family. The sheer audacity of her words hung in the air. Family loyalty. It was the exact phrase I knew she would use. It was the ultimate manipulation tool of the toxic parent, a hollow buzzword designed to force obedience from the child they had spent decades mistreating. I looked around the lobby. Several wealthy residents had stopped near the elevators, blatantly eavesdropping on the spectacle. The concierge and 2 security guards were watching intently. I wanted them to hear every single word. I wanted my parents stripped of their carefully curated social standing right here in public. Family loyalty. I repeated, letting the words roll off my tongue with a lethal dose of sarcasm. Is that what we are calling it now? Let us talk about family loyalty, Mom. Let us talk about the summer I turned 18. Do you remember that summer? I do. I had just been accepted into my dream university. I had worked 3 part-time jobs throughout high school to save up for my tuition, and I put every single paycheck into a joint college savings account that Dad controlled. Richard stiffened, his bloodshot eyes widening as he realized exactly what I was about to say in front of an audience. Kendall, keep your voice down, he hissed nervously, glancing at the bystanders. This is not the place for this. "Oh, I think it is the exact place for this," I replied loudly, my voice carrying clearly across the marble lobby. I had $50,000 saved in that account. And then a week before my tuition was due, Brittany got arrested. She got behind the wheel of her sports car while completely intoxicated and crashed it into a storefront. She was facing felony charges. And what did you do, Dad? What did you do with my hard-earned money in the name of family loyalty? Susan covered her face with her hands, sobbing loudly while Richard clenched his jaw, unable to look me in the eye. You drained it, I stated, the cold fury of that memory still sharp after all these years. You emptied my entire college fund without asking me. You took every single cent I had worked for and used it to pay off the store owner and hire an expensive defense attorney to keep your golden child out of jail. When I found out and confronted you, you told me I was being selfish. You told me I needed to sacrifice for the family. You forced me to take out massive student loans that took me a decade to pay off, all while you continued to buy Brittany designer handbags. The residents watching the scene exchanged shocked, disgusted whispers. The head of security looked at my father with open contempt. Richard was physically shrinking under the weight of his own exposed hypocrisy. You did not care about family loyalty when you stole my future to clean up her mess. I continued, stepping closer to the security line, my eyes locked onto my father's terrified face. You did not care about family loyalty when you stood by and laughed while Jamal mocked me at your anniversary party. You only care about family loyalty now because I am the one holding the deed to your house and you are terrified of losing your country club status. We made a mistake, Susan wailed, reaching out toward me again. We were just trying to protect your sister. We are sorry. Please, Kendall, we have nothing. We do not even have money for a hotel tonight. You have to let us stay here. I looked at her, feeling absolutely no pity. You should call Brittany. Since you sacrificed my entire college fund to keep her out of prison, and since you sacrificed your own home so Jamal could play crypto billionaire, I am sure they will be more than happy to let you sleep on their couch. I turned my attention to the head of security. Marcus, these two individuals are trespassing. They are not on my guest list, and they never will be. If they do not leave the premises immediately, please call the Miami Police Department and have them arrested for harassment. Yes, Miss Kendall, Marcus replied firmly, turning his broad shoulders toward my parents. Sir, ma'am, it is time for you to leave. Now. Kendall, you cannot do this! Richard screamed, his voice cracking with a mixture of exhaustion and panic as the security guards began to physically herd them toward the sliding glass doors. You vindictive, ungrateful brat. We are your parents. I turned my back on them and walked toward the private elevator. I pressed the call button, listening to the sounds of my father shouting and my mother sobbing as they were pushed out into the humid Florida night. The heavy glass doors slid shut, cutting off their noise entirely. The elevator arrived with a soft chime. I stepped inside the doors, closing smoothly, carrying me back up to the empire I had built with my own two hands. They were locked out of my building, out of my life, and very soon out of their house. The morning sun rose over Biscayne Bay, flooding my penthouse with warm golden light. I was sitting at my kitchen island with a fresh cup of espresso, reviewing quarterly earnings reports on my tablet, completely unbothered by the dramatic expulsion of my parents the night before. I assumed they were currently sleeping in their leased vehicle at a rest stop somewhere off Interstate 95. I had slept perfectly. But just as I took my second sip of coffee, my phone screen illuminated. And then it illuminated again. Within 60 seconds, the device was vibrating violently against the marble countertop, flooded with an absolute avalanche of notifications. I picked up the phone and unlocked it. I had 72 unread text messages, 14 missed calls, and hundreds of tags on social media. I opened my messages first. You are a disgusting, greedy monster. Read a text from my Aunt Carol. How dare you put your own mother and father out on the street? You are dead to this family. I swiped to the next message. It was from my cousin Leo. I hope your corporate money keeps you warm at night, you heartless snake. Watch your back if you ever step foot in Boston again. There were dozens more, each one more vitriolic and unhinged than the last. Relatives I had not spoken to in over a decade were suddenly crawling out of the woodwork to hurl death threats and insults at me. They called me a vulture, a sociopath, a corporate predator who had engineered a hostile takeover of my own childhood home. It was a highly coordinated attack, and I knew exactly who the architect was. I opened my social media application and tapped on my notification tab. My sister Brittany had been busy. She had uploaded a 3-minute video that was already going massively viral. It had over 2 million views, hundreds of thousands of likes, and a comment section entirely dedicated to destroying my reputation. I clicked play and watched my sister perform the greatest acting role of her entirely fabricated life. Brittany was sitting on the floor of her perfectly curated, aesthetically pleasing bedroom. She was wearing an oversized beige sweater that swallowed her small frame, making her look incredibly fragile and defenseless. She wore no makeup, or at least the illusion of no makeup, with her blonde hair pulled into a messy bun. Her eyes were red and puffy. She looked directly into the camera and let out a shaky, dramatic breath. "Hey guys," Brittany whispered, her voice cracking flawlessly. "I have never done a video like this before, but I am just so heartbroken and I do not know where else to turn. My family is going through an absolute nightmare right now. My older sister, who is a multi-millionaire executive at a corporate debt firm in Miami, just bought the mortgage to our childhood home. My parents fell behind on a few payments because of a misunderstanding, and instead of helping them, my sister swooped in, bought the debt, and handed them a 7-day eviction notice." She paused to wipe a perfectly timed tear from her cheek. She knows my parents do not have the cash liquid right now to fight her. She is using her corporate lawyers to bully an elderly couple out of the only home they have ever known, just because she has always hated me and wants to destroy our family. "Please, if you know any pro bono real estate lawyers in Boston, reach out. We are terrified." I watched the video twice. I did not feel a single pang of sadness. I did not shed a tear. I did not feel the urge to call her and scream. Instead, a cold, clinical satisfaction washed over me. Brittany thought she was winning the public relations war. She thought she could weaponize the internet against me, painting me as the evil capitalist and herself as the innocent victim. What she did not realize was that by posting that video, she had just handed me a golden ticket for a massive civil defamation lawsuit. And even worse for her, she had publicly admitted that the debt existed, completely bypassing the fact that her husband had illegally forged the documents to obtain it. I did not reply to Aunt Carol. I did not block Cousin Leo. I did not turn off my comments or set my profile to private. When you are building a legal case, you never interrupt your enemy when they are making a mistake. You let them dig the hole as deep as possible. I spent the next 2 hours meticulously screenshotting every single threatening text message, every hateful voicemail transcript, and every defamatory comment left by my extended family. I screen-recorded Brittany's viral video, ensuring I captured the view count and the engagement metrics to prove the scale of the reputational damage she was attempting to inflict. Once I had compiled a massive digital file, I opened my encrypted email and attached the entire folder. I typed in the email address of Donovan, the senior private investigator retained by my firm. Donovan was a former intelligence officer who specialized in forensic accounting and digital footprints. He did not care about family drama. He only cared about data wire transfers and IP addresses. Donovan. I typed, my fingers flying across the keyboard with calculated precision. "My sister has just launched a public defamation campaign against me regarding the Boston estate. Please review the attached files for a future civil suit. However, that is secondary. I need you to accelerate the primary objective. I want the complete digital footprint of my brother-in-law Jamal. I need the IP logs from the day the forged mortgage was electronically signed. I need the routing numbers of the offshore accounts where he wired the $1.5 million. I want every single penny tracked, and I want irrefutable proof that he acted alone in the financial fraud." I hit send. The internet was currently having a field day, tearing me apart. Let them. Let the public rage against the wealthy corporate executive. Let my family believe they had successfully backed me into a corner with their social media bullying. They were playing a game of checkers on a digital playground, trying to win likes and sympathy from strangers. I was playing high-stakes legal chess. I was not building a social media response. I was building a federal indictment. I finished my espresso, placed the empty cup in the sink, and started getting dressed for work. Jamal and Brittany wanted to play the victim on the internet, but they were about to find out that the federal government does not care about your follower count when they bring you up on charges of wire fraud. By 9 in the morning, the sweltering Florida heat was already beginning to radiate off the pavement, but I felt entirely cold and focused. I stepped out of an air-conditioned black town car in front of the Federal Bureau of Investigation field office in North Miami Beach. The building was an imposing, brutalist structure of heavy concrete and tinted glass, standing in stark contrast to the colorful Art Deco hotels just a few miles away. While my sister was busy lying on her bedroom floor, refreshing her social media page to count her sympathy likes and monetizing her fake tears, I was walking through metal detectors and presenting my state identification to armed federal guards. I was directed down a series of sterile, brightly lit hallways until I reached a windowless conference room that smelled faintly of industrial cleaner and stale coffee. I placed my designer briefcase on the long metal table and waited. A few minutes later, the door opened, and Special Agent Reynolds walked in. He was a seasoned investigator in the white-collar crime division, a no-nonsense man in his late 40s, with sharp analytical eyes and a dark suit that prioritized function over fashion. He sat across from me, holding the thick leather-bound dossier I had sent over by secure courier earlier that morning. Miss Kendall Reynolds began tapping his pen against the edge of the table. I reviewed the file your private investigator sent over. You understand that the Bureau does not involve itself in messy family inheritance disputes or civil eviction matters. If your parents defaulted on a commercial mortgage, that is a state civil issue for the local courts in Massachusetts. I am not here about a civil eviction, Agent Reynolds, I replied smoothly, leaning forward and resting my hands on the cool table. I am here to report a $1.5 million interstate wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and the illegal transfer of illicit funds to an offshore tax haven. The eviction is simply the collateral damage. Please turn to tab 3. Reynolds raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued by my complete lack of emotion, and flipped the thick cardstock divider. His eyes scanned the documents my investigator Donovan had meticulously compiled overnight. I walked him through the timeline with surgical precision. I showed him the forged commercial mortgage agreement executed in Boston. Then I directed his attention to the digital signature logs. Jamal is not the criminal mastermind he pretends to be on the internet, I explained, watching Reynolds study the IP logs. He used a basic commercially available virtual private network to mask his location when he electronically signed my father's name on the loan documents. But he got sloppy. He logged into his personal cloud storage account from the exact same hardware device 3 minutes before executing the forged signature. My investigator traced the hardware control address directly to Jamal's leased laptop, which was connected to the public wireless network at a coffee shop less than 2 miles from my parents' estate. Reynolds traced the lines of data with his pen, nodding slowly as the irrefutable digital footprint laid itself bare. Now look at tab 4. I instructed, my voice sharp and steady. The money trail. Once the predatory lending company approved the loan based on my father's forged signature and falsely inflated asset portfolio, the $1.5 million was wired out. But it did not go to my father's bank account. It went to a newly formed shell company registered in Delaware under a fictitious name. From Delaware, the funds were immediately wired to an offshore banking institution in the Bahamas. I paused, letting the severity of the federal violations sink in. Within 48 hours of the funds hitting the Bahamas, Jamal transferred the entire balance into an unregulated cryptocurrency exchange based in Eastern Europe. He bought highly leveraged margin positions on extremely volatile digital assets. 2 weeks later, the market experienced a massive correction, and his entire position was liquidated. The money is completely gone. Reynolds closed the folder, leaning back in his chair and letting out a low whistle. Because the fraud involved electronic communications across state lines and the illegal transfer of funds through federal banking systems, it had instantly escalated from a local police matter to a massive federal crime. Jamal was no longer dealing with a civil lawsuit. He was looking at up to 20 years in a federal penitentiary for the wire fraud alone, plus additional years for identity theft. "You brought us a neatly tied package," Miss Kendall Reynolds said, a hint of genuine professional respect in his voice. The United States Attorney's Office loves a slam-dunk case with this much forensic accounting already completed. But to secure an immediate federal indictment and prevent him from fleeing the country when he realizes the walls are closing in, a recorded admission of guilt regarding the forgery would speed up the warrant process immensely. A slow, calculating smile touched my lips. The thrill of the hunt was intoxicating. "I can get you that admission on tape." "How do you plan to do that?" Reynolds asked, narrowing his eyes. "Jamal thinks I am only pursuing a civil eviction to be petty," I replied, my mind already 10 steps ahead of my family. "He thinks my parents are going to shield him from any real consequences because they are terrified of public scandal. If I offer them a formal legal mediation back in Boston to discuss signing the house back over to them, his massive ego will force him to show up. He will want to gloat. He will want to look like the victorious alpha male who outsmarted the bitter older sister. I will corner him in that room and I will get him to admit to the forgery." Reynolds nodded slowly, recognizing the sheer ruthlessness of the predator sitting across from him. "Set the meeting. Coordinate the time and location with my office. We will have federal agents on standby outside the conference room." I stood up, smoothed my trousers, and shook his hand. I walked out of the federal building an hour later, the bright Florida sun warming my skin. I pulled my phone from my purse. It was still blowing up. My notifications were a constant chaotic stream of hatred from strangers on the internet who had bought into Britney's tearful performance. My inbox was flooded with emails from distant relatives calling me a monster and threatening to disown me. I did not care. Let them scream. Let them trend on social media. Let Britney enjoy her fleeting viral fame. They were fighting a war of public perception, completely blind to the fact that I had just dropped a nuclear bomb on their entire reality. The trap was perfectly set. The federal authorities were waiting in the shadows, and all I had to do now was bait the hook and wait for my arrogant brother-in-law to bite. It took exactly 48 hours for the bait to work. I was sitting at my polished glass desk on the 40th floor of the K Holdings Tower in downtown Miami. The panoramic view of the Atlantic Ocean usually provided a calming backdrop to my grueling workdays, but today my focus was entirely on the internal security feed glowing on my secondary monitor. I watched as my brother-in-law strutted into the pristine marble-lined reception area of my firm. He was wearing a loud silk designer shirt, unbuttoned halfway down his chest, and expensive loafers without socks. He looked like a man trying desperately to project massive wealth, which only confirmed my suspicion that he had drained the absolute last of his stolen funds just to buy a last-minute plane ticket to Florida. He was not alone. Trailing slightly behind Jamal was a short, sweaty man in an ill-fitting, off-the-rack gray suit. The man was clutching a cheap faux leather briefcase and looking around the high-security corporate office with wide, nervous eyes. The intercom on my desk chimed. Miss Kendall, my receptionist, announced, her voice perfectly level. "A Mr. Jamal is here to see you. He claims it is a legal emergency and says he has his attorney with him. He is demanding immediate access." "Send them back," I instructed, leaning back in my ergonomic leather chair and steepling my fingers. A moment later, the heavy glass doors to my private office swung open. Jamal marched in with the exaggerated swagger of a man who believed he was holding a winning lottery ticket. He did not ask for permission to sit. He dropped himself into one of the imported leather guest chairs opposite my desk, crossing his ankle over his knee. His sweaty companion hovered nervously beside him before awkwardly taking the second chair, placing his cheap briefcase on his lap like a shield. "Well?" Kendall Jamal sneered, a triumphant grin plastered across his face. "You thought you could just push my family around from your little ivory tower. You thought you could steal our house and get away with it, but you messed with the wrong guy. I told you I have connections. Meet my lead legal counsel, Kevin." Kevin cleared his throat loudly, trying to puff out his chest to match Jamal's arrogant energy. He popped the latches on his briefcase and pulled out a stack of papers that looked suspiciously like they had been printed from a free legal template website. He slapped the papers down on my immaculate glass desk. Miss Kendall. Kevin began, his voice surprisingly reedy. I represent your brother-in-law and your parents. We are serving you with this official cease and desist order. You are to immediately halt all eviction proceedings against the Boston property. Furthermore, we are preparing to file a massive civil lawsuit against you and your firm for defamation of character, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and tortious interference with a family estate. If you do not sign the deed back over to Richard today, we will take you to court and bleed you dry. Jamal leaned forward, pointing a finger at me. You hear that? We are going to sue you for everything you have. You are going to be ruined. I did not blink. I did not move. I simply let the silence stretch out thick and suffocating until Kevin physically shifted in his seat, the leather squeaking loudly under his nervous weight. Slowly, I reached out and picked up the printed papers. I scanned the first page, my eyes catching 3 distinct spelling errors in the first paragraph alone. I looked up at Kevin. A slow, chilling smile spread across my face. This is a fascinating document, Kevin, I said, keeping my voice low and dangerously calm. Tell me, where did you obtain your law degree? Kevin blinked, a bead of sweat forming on his forehead. I do not see how that is relevant to the demands we have presented. It is incredibly relevant, I replied, tossing the papers back onto the desk with a dismissive flick of my wrist. Because this document cites California state law regarding tenant rights, but the property in question is located in Massachusetts, and you are currently attempting to extort a corporate officer in the state of Florida. So I will ask you again, what is your state bar registration number? Kevin swallowed hard, his eyes darting toward Jamal. Jamal scoffed, waving his hand. You do not have to answer her, Kevin. She is just trying to intimidate us with her corporate attitude. I ignored Jamal, completely locking my eyes entirely on his sweating companion. Let us talk about tortious interference, Kevin. Since you are the lead counsel, you must be intimately familiar with the Uniform Commercial Code. Can you explain to me how my firm executing a perfectly legal UCC filing on a defaulted commercial mortgage constitutes tortious interference? Kevin opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked like a deer caught in the headlights of a speeding freight train. Let me save you the trouble. I continued, my voice sharpening into a lethal blade. You cannot explain it because you have absolutely no idea what I am talking about. You are not a lawyer. You are a loudmouth buddy Jamal promised to buy a steak dinner if you came down here and played dress-up. But unfortunately for you, Kevin impersonating an attorney in order to extort a registered financial institution is a felony in the state of Florida. It is called the unauthorized practice of law, and it carries a mandatory prison sentence. The color instantly drained from Kevin's face. He looked absolutely terrified. Furthermore, I said, reaching a hand toward my desk phone, this office is under constant video and audio surveillance. I have your entire extortion attempt recorded. Now I am going to press this button and call building security to hold you here while I contact the Miami Police Department to have you arrested for federal extortion. Wait, hold on. Kevin shrieked, his voice cracking an octave higher. He scrambled out of his chair so fast he nearly tipped it over. He snatched his cheap briefcase off his lap, completely abandoning the printed papers on my desk. Jamal told me this was just a family dispute. He told me you were just a jealous sister and you would back down if I used some legal words. I did not sign up for federal charges. I am out of here. Kevin, what are you doing? Jamal shouted, jumping up from his chair. Sit back down. We are not done here. But Kevin was already running. He pushed through the heavy glass doors of my office and sprinted across the reception area, desperately slamming his hand against the elevator call button. Jamal was left standing alone in the center of my office, his grand intimidation tactic completely shattered into pieces. The silence returned to the room. I looked at Jamal, who was staring at the empty doorway, his jaw clenched, his chest heaving with humiliated rage. He turned slowly back to face me. All of the fake billionaire swagger had evaporated, leaving behind nothing but a desperate, cornered man who had just played his final pathetic card and lost spectacularly. This is not over, Kendall, Jamal hissed, though his voice lacked any real conviction. You think you are so smart. I looked at him with an expression of pure, calculated pity. I let my shoulders drop slightly, pretending to exhale a tired, defeated sigh. I needed him to think he still had a chance. "Sit down, Jamal," I said softly, rubbing my temples, as if the stress was finally getting to me. "I do not want to involve the police. I am exhausted by all of this. The media attention is starting to affect my firm's reputation, and my board of directors is furious about Brittany's viral video." Jamal's eyes widened slightly. The bait was dangling right in front of him. "I want this to go away just as much as you do." I lied, my voice sounding strained. "If I agree to fly back to Boston this weekend for a formal legal mediation, will you and my parents be there to sign a settlement agreement? I am willing to discuss transferring the deed back to the family, provided we can keep this entirely out of the courts and off the internet." Jamal puffed out his chest, a sickeningly smug smile returning to his face. He actually believed he had broken me. He believed my corporate facade was crumbling under the weight of his social media campaign. "I knew you would fold," Jamal scoffed, straightening his silk shirt. "Yeah, we will be there. You bring the deed and maybe we will forgive you for putting us through this stress." I watched him walk out of my office, his arrogant strut returning. He had no idea he had just agreed to walk directly into a federal ambush. I kept my eyes on the security monitors on my desk, tracking Jamal as he navigated the marble lobby of the K Holdings building. He walked with an exaggerated swagger, his chest puffed out, completely oblivious to the fact that his fake lawyer had already sprinted out the revolving doors in sheer terror. Jamal pulled out his phone the moment he stepped onto the sunlit Miami pavement. I did not need to wiretap his device to know exactly who he was calling and what fabricated story he was spinning. I picked up my own phone and dialed Special Agent Reynolds. "The bait is taken," I said the moment the federal agent answered the line. "He agreed to a formal mediation in Boston this Friday. He thinks I am surrendering the deed to avoid further public relations damage to my firm." "Excellent work," Miss Kendall Reynolds replied, the professional satisfaction evident in his tone. "I will coordinate with the Boston field office. We will have plainclothes agents positioned in the building and a tactical team on standby in the underground parking garage. All you need to do is get him talking on the record." I ended the call and leaned back in my chair, feeling a deep, resonating sense of calm. The hardest part of catching a predator is convincing them they are the one hunting you. Hundreds of miles away inside the sprawling colonial estate that my firm legally owned, my family was busy throwing a victory celebration. My private investigator Donovan had tapped into the public social media feeds of my sister and her inner circle, providing me with a real-time window into their utter delusion. According to the updates and the information filtering through our extended family network, Jamal had returned to Boston as a conquering hero. He stood in the massive kitchen of the estate, drinking my father's expensive scotch, and spun a tale of absolute fiction. He told Richard and Susan that he had marched into my corporate headquarters and verbally destroyed me. He claimed that my lawyers were terrified of his legal threats, that my board of directors was threatening to fire me over the bad press, and that I had practically begged him to settle the matter quietly. He painted himself as the brilliant, aggressive businessman who had successfully bullied the ruthless corporate executive into submission. And my parents swallowed every single word of it. They did not question why his supposed lead counsel was not with him. They did not question why a multi-million-dollar financial institution would suddenly fold after a single meeting. They believed Jamal's story because they desperately needed to believe it. They needed to believe that their golden son-in-law was a genius and that their scapegoat daughter was a coward. Richard immediately regained his pompous country club arrogance. The sheer terror he had experienced during their 20-hour drive to Miami evaporated, replaced by a smug, toxic vindication. He called his friends, bragging that he had put his ungrateful daughter in her place and that she was flying up to Boston to formally apologize and return his property. He genuinely believed that the natural order of the universe had been restored, that the family hierarchy was intact, and that he was once again the untouchable patriarch. Susan, equally relieved and delusional, went straight back to enabling her favorite child. She took Brittany out for a lavish lunch at a high-end bistro, putting the meal on a credit card that she was completely unaware would soon be subpoenaed by the federal government. She patted Brittany's hand, assuring her that the nightmare was over and that they had successfully defeated the villain of the family. Brittany, true to her narcissistic nature, could not resist taking a public victory lap. She posted a new video to her followers. She was sitting in her aesthetic living room wearing a soft pastel outfit and smiling a serene, forgiving smile. "Hey guys," Brittany cooed into the camera, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "I just wanted to give you an update and thank you for all your incredible support. The power of the internet is amazing. Because of your voices, my sister has finally agreed to do the right thing. We are having a formal mediation this Friday where she is going to return our childhood home. It has been such a dark, painful week, but love and family always win in the end. I am choosing to forgive her because holding on to toxic energy is just not my brand." Watching that video did not make me angry. It made me laugh. It was a cold, sharp laugh that echoed in the emptiness of my office. Brittany thought she had won. She thought she had successfully manipulated the narrative and secured her luxurious lifestyle. She had absolutely no idea that she had just publicly broadcasted her involvement in a situation that was about to become a federal crime scene. The rest of the week passed in a blur of meticulous preparation. I did not engage with any of the celebratory, mocking text messages that rolled in from my relatives. I let them gloat. I let them build their glass castle as high as they possibly could, knowing exactly how spectacular the crash would be when I finally shattered the foundation. I instructed my legal team to book the largest, most intimidating conference room at a premier law firm in downtown Boston. I wanted the setting to feel incredibly formal, a place where my family would walk in feeling powerful and untouchable. I coordinated with the audio-visual technicians to ensure the room recording equipment was flawless, providing a direct, crystal-clear feed to the federal agents who would be waiting in the adjacent suite. On Thursday evening, I packed a sleek black leather briefcase. I did not pack clothes or personal items. I packed the forensic handwriting analysis that proved Jamal forged my father's signature. I packed the server logs showing his virtual private network activity. I packed the bank statements tracking the stolen $1.5 million straight into a failed offshore cryptocurrency account. I packed the absolute destruction of their entire reality. I boarded a private jet chartered by my firm, leaving the warm Miami evening behind for the crisp, unforgiving chill of Boston. As the aircraft broke through the cloud cover, I looked out the window at the sprawling city lights below. My parents, my sister, and her fraudulent husband were somewhere down there sleeping soundly in a mansion they no longer owned, dreaming of their grand victory. They had taken the bait hook, line, and sinker. Tomorrow morning they would walk into that mediation room expecting a surrender. Instead, they were going to step directly into a slaughterhouse. Friday morning arrived with a sharp biting wind sweeping off the Boston harbor, but inside the 50th floor conference room of the city's most prestigious law firm, the air was perfectly climate-controlled and utterly still. I sat at the far end of a massive polished mahogany table. The room was surrounded by floor-to-ceiling glass windows offering a sweeping, dominant view of the city skyline. Next to me sat my lead corporate attorney, a man whose hourly rate exceeded what my brother-in-law made in a year. Hidden entirely from view in the adjoining suite, connected by a discreetly wired audio feed, sat Special Agent Reynolds and two other federal officers. The trap was armed. All we needed was for the targets to walk inside. They made sure to arrive exactly 20 minutes late. It was a classic transparent power play, designed by Richard to prove that his time was far more valuable than mine. The heavy glass doors of the conference room swung open, and my family paraded inside, as if they were walking onto a red carpet. Richard led the charge wearing a navy blue blazer and an arrogant scowl. He did not even bother to look at me or my attorney, immediately barking at a passing paralegal to bring him a black coffee. Susan followed closely behind, clutching her expensive designer handbag, like a shield wearing an expression of exhausted martyrdom. Brittany walked in with her phone held high, recording the opulent surroundings for her followers, carefully angling the camera to capture her own perfectly styled hair while avoiding my face. And then there was Jamal. He strolled into the room with his chest puffed out so far he looked ridiculous. He was wearing a light gray suit that was a fraction too tight, grinning like a man who had just conquered the world. He pulled out a leather chair for Brittany with exaggerated chivalry, then dropped himself into the seat directly across from me. He leaned back, lacing his fingers behind his head, entirely comfortable in a room where he was about to lose his freedom. "Well," Richard announced loudly, taking his seat at the center of the table and aggressively smoothing his tie. "Let us get this over with. I have a tea time at the club at noon, and I have already wasted enough of my week dealing with this absolute nonsense." My corporate attorney opened his mouth to speak, but Jamal quickly cut him off, leaning forward and pointing a finger across the table. "Hold on, suit," Jamal sneered, directing his words at my lawyer but keeping his smug eyes locked on me. "We do not need to hear any long-winded legal speeches today. Kendall knows exactly why we are here. She realized she made a massive mistake trying to play hardball with us, and she is here to return my father-in-law's property. We are not negotiating. We are just here to collect the signatures and leave." Brittany set her phone face down on the mahogany surface, letting out a heavy, dramatic sigh. "Honestly, Kendall, I do not even know why we had to come all the way down to this stuffy office. You could have just mailed the documents. This entire ordeal has been so incredibly draining for my mental health. My aura is completely exhausted. But I guess you needed one last dramatic moment to make yourself feel important before you apologize." I did not react. I did not frown. I did not glare. I did not offer a single word of defense. I simply sat there perfectly still, letting their arrogance echo off the glass walls. I wanted the federal agents in the next room to hear every single syllable of their entitlement. Susan, interpreting my silence as submission, leaned forward. She adopted the patronizing, disappointed mother persona she had perfected over the last 3 decades. "Kendall, just sign the papers quickly so we can forget you ever did this," Susan said, her voice dripping with artificial benevolence. "We are willing to put this ugly chapter behind us. We are a family. Families fight, but at the end of the day we forgive each other. Just sign the deed over to your father, drop the foreclosure, and we will pretend this little tantrum never happened. You can fly back to Miami and we can all move on with our lives." Richard tapped his gold watch impatiently against the wood. "You heard your mother. Where is the release form? I want to sign it and get out of here. The valet is keeping my car running." The sheer magnitude of their delusion was almost breathtaking. They were sitting in a high-security corporate law firm, demanding that a multi-million-dollar debt simply vanish because they deemed it inconvenient. Jamal smirked at me, giving me a slight patronizing nod, genuinely believing that his fake lawyer and his empty threats had intimidated me into surrendering the only leverage I had. My attorney looked at me, waiting for my signal. I gave him a subtle nod. "Before we proceed with any transfer of assets," my attorney stated, his voice ringing with absolute professional authority, "we are legally required to review the underlying documentation regarding the defaulted loan in question. Since K Holdings purchased this debt portfolio from the commercial lender, we conducted a standard audit of the original mortgage agreement." Richard rolled his eyes, throwing his hands up in frustration. "We do not need an audit. We already know the bank made a mistake. Jamal explained everything. Just give me the damn pen." I finally moved. I reached down to the floor beside my chair and lifted a single incredibly thick black leather folder. I placed it squarely on the table in front of me. The loud, heavy thud of the folder hitting the solid wood silenced my father instantly. I kept my eyes locked directly on Jamal. The smug grin was still pasted on his face, but a tiny flicker of uncertainty finally sparked in his eyes as he stared at the massive file. "You are right, Mom," I said, my voice completely flat and echoing in the quiet room. "We should get this over with quickly. But before I sign anything, I want everyone at this table to look at what I brought." I placed my hand flat on top of the black leather cover. With a slow, deliberate push, I slid the heavy folder across the polished mahogany surface. It glided smoothly, stopping exactly in the center of the table, equidistant from Richard, Susan, and Jamal. "Open it," I commanded softly. Jamal hesitated, his eyes darting from the folder to my face. The confidence was beginning to drain from his posture. Richard, entirely oblivious to the shifting dynamic, reached out and aggressively flipped the heavy cover open. The room fell into a dead, suffocating silence as my family stared down at the first page of their absolute destruction. Richard's eyes scanned the crisp white paper resting inside the black leather folder. I watched his brow furrow in deep confusion as he realized the document bore no resemblance to a property deed or a settlement agreement. At the top of the page, printed in bold, uncompromising letters, was the letterhead of a nationally recognized forensic document examination firm. My corporate attorney sat perfectly still beside me, his hands folded neatly on the table, watching the family dynamic implode with professional detachment. He did not need to speak. I was orchestrating this execution entirely on my own. "What is this nonsense?" Richard muttered, his voice lacking its previous booming confidence. He squinted at the high-resolution photographs printed on the heavy stock paper. On the left side of the page was a magnified image of his actual signature legally obtained from his publicly filed tax returns. On the right side was the signature from the commercial mortgage agreement. Brilliant red lines and digital markers highlighted the glaring discrepancies in the pen strokes, the incorrect pressure points, and the awkward angle of the lettering. "That is a comprehensive forensic handwriting analysis," I explained, keeping my tone perfectly measured and devoid of any emotion. "My firm commissioned it the very moment we purchased the defaulted debt from the hard money lender." The certified examiner, a man who has testified in hundreds of federal cases, concluded with absolute certainty that the signature on the $1.5 million mortgage was not executed by you, Dad. It was a deliberate, highly calculated forgery. Jamal shifted violently in his leather chair. The smug, victorious grin that had been plastered across his face just moments before began to melt away, replaced by a visible twitch in his jaw. He let out a loud, forced laugh, waving his hand dismissively at the black folder. "This is a complete joke," Jamal scoffed, though his voice cracked slightly on the last word. "You printed some fake charts to try and scare us into dropping our lawsuit. I told you, Richard. She is just trying to stall because she knows she lost. My lawyer will tear this garbage apart in court. We are not falling for this corporate intimidation tactic." I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the mahogany table, locking my eyes entirely on him. "Your lawyer, Kevin, is currently under active investigation for the unauthorized practice of law in the state of Florida after his disastrous sweating performance in my office on Wednesday. He will not be tearing anything apart. He is currently begging for immunity. And this report was generated by a former federal forensic analyst. It is already admissible in a court of law. You forged my father's signature, Jamal. You committed identity theft to secure a commercial loan, and you used this family estate as collateral because you were broke." Susan gasped sharply, her manicured hand flying to her chest. She looked at Jamal, her eyes wide, waiting for him to produce a brilliant defense or a clever financial explanation. But Jamal was staring blankly at the table, a thick sheen of sweat forming on his forehead. Richard looked physically ill. The horrifying reality that his son-in-law was not a crypto genius, but a desperate low-level criminal, was finally breaching his titanium walls of denial. "But that is only the first layer of the fraud," I continued, my voice slicing effortlessly through their rising panic. I reached across the wide table and flipped the heavy page of the folder. The crisp sound of the turning paper seemed to echo in the silent room. "I want you to look very closely at the bottom of the mortgage document, specifically the notary section." Richard leaned in, his hands trembling slightly as he read the small print. In order to finalize a commercial mortgage of that magnitude, the forged signature had to legally be notarized. Someone with a state-issued license had to officially stamp the document, swearing under penalty of perjury that they had personally verified Richard's identity and physically witnessed him signing the paper. "Who notarized it?" Richard whispered, his voice reduced to a hoarse, terrified rasp. "Read the name, Dad," I commanded coldly. He stared at the notary stamp, his face draining of all remaining color until he looked like a ghost. "It is Brittany's stamp," he breathed out the words, sounding like a definitive death sentence for his perfect family. The entire room seemed to freeze. The air conditioning hummed quietly above us, the only sound in a space that had suddenly become a tomb. Susan turned her head slowly, painfully, to look at her golden child. Brittany, who had been busy checking her phone just moments before, suddenly looked like she was going to be physically sick. The camera she had set up to record her grand victory was still rolling, capturing the exact moment her meticulously crafted innocent persona shattered into a million irreparable pieces. Brittany Susan cried out, her voice trembling with absolute unadulterated horror. "Tell me this is a mistake. Tell me you did not help him steal our house." Brittany burst into tears, but this time they were not the delicate performative tears she used to garner sympathy from her social media followers. This was raw, ugly, hyperventilating panic. "Daddy, I did not know what I was signing," she wailed loudly, reaching across the table to desperately grab his sleeve. "Jamal just put a giant stack of papers in front of me and told me to stamp them. He said it was for his new cryptocurrency business. He said it was a surprise for you and Mom. I swear to God I did not know it was the deed to the house." Jamal slammed his hands down on the table, instantly throwing his wife under the bus to save his own skin. "Are you kidding me right now, Brittany? You knew exactly what those papers were. You are the one who told me exactly where your dad kept his old tax returns in the study so I could trace the signature. You needed the cash to pay off your luxury credit cards before the department stores sued you. Do not sit there and act like a victim. You were in on it from day one." The look of utter devastation on my parents' faces was absolute. The golden child, the daughter they had sacrificed my entire college fund for, the daughter they had protected and elevated above me. Her entire life was a willing accomplice in their financial ruin. She had used her state-issued notary license to help her fraudulent husband steal $1.5 million from her own parents. It was a clear-cut felony. It was a documented conspiracy to commit wire fraud. And the irrefutable evidence was sitting right in front of them in undeniable black and white. "You thought I brought you here to surrender," I said, my voice quiet, but commanding the absolute attention of everyone in the room. "You thought you could bully me into giving you the deed to cover up your crimes, but I did not bring you here to negotiate a settlement. I brought you here so you could look at the exact evidence that is going to send both of you to federal prison." Jamal let out a loud, forced scoff, throwing his hands in the air as if he were dealing with a petulant child. He was cornered, but his narcissistic ego refused to let him surrender without a fight. "Come on, Kendall," he stammered, his voice lacking its usual booming resonance. "You are being completely dramatic. Nobody is going to federal prison over a simple family misunderstanding. I did not steal anything. I moved some assets around to secure a better return on investment for the family portfolio. It was a bridge loan. The money is perfectly safe. It is just tied up in a high-yield escrow account right now." I stared at him, marveling at his ability to lie with such pathetic desperation, even as the walls closed in around him. He actually thought he could bluff his way out of a documented paper trail. "Is it tied up in escrow, Jamal?" I asked, my voice dangerously soft. I reached across the table and tapped the black leather folder. "Turn to the next page. Let us see exactly how safe that $1.5 million really is." Richard, whose hands were still shaking violently from the revelation of the forged signature, aggressively flipped the thick parchment page. He stared down at a dense, highly detailed spreadsheet filled with routing numbers, timestamps, and banking institution logos. "That is a certified financial forensic trace," I explained to the room, though my eyes never left Jamal's sweating face. "When the hard money lender approved the loan based on your forged signature, Dad, they wired the funds. But the money did not go into your personal bank account. It did not go into a family trust. It went directly into a limited liability company registered in Delaware under a completely fictitious name. A shell company that Jamal established exactly 3 days before the mortgage was signed." Richard looked up from the paper, his chest heaving as he struggled to process the sheer scale of the betrayal. "He transferred the money to himself." Richard gasped, his voice cracking under the weight of the realization. "Oh, he did not keep it there for long." I continued relentlessly. "Turn the page again, Dad." Richard flipped the page. Susan leaned over his shoulder, her manicured fingers gripping the edge of the mahogany table so tightly her knuckles were completely white. "Within 2 hours of the funds hitting the Delaware account?" Jamal initiated an international wire transfer, I stated, laying out the irrefutable facts like a prosecutor delivering a closing argument. He moved the entire $1.5 million to an offshore banking institution located in the Bahamas. He thought moving the money outside of the United States jurisdiction would make it untraceable. He thought he was outsmarting the federal banking system. But he used the exact same commercial virtual private network to initiate the wire transfer that he used to forge the signature. My private investigator pulled the Internet Protocol logs. We tracked the digital footprint straight to his leased laptop. Jamal's face was no longer pale. It was a sickly ashen gray. The smugness was entirely gone, replaced by the terrified realization that I knew absolutely everything. He opened his mouth to speak, to offer some ridiculous financial jargon to explain away the offshore transfer, but I cut him off before he could form a single syllable. "And that brings us to the grand finale," I said, leaning back in my chair and folding my hands together perfectly on my lap. "Turn to the final page, Dad. Tell the room where the money went next." Richard turned to the last page of the financial report. It was a screenshot of a digital ledger from an unregulated cryptocurrency exchange based in Eastern Europe. The account was registered under Jamal's alias. The final balance displayed at the bottom of the page was printed in bold red ink: $0.00. "What is this?" Richard whispered, his eyes frantically scanning the rows of negative numbers and liquidated assets. "Where is my money, Jamal? Where is the $1.5 million? "It is gone, Dad," I answered, for him delivering the ultimate crushing blow. "Jamal did not put the money in escrow. He did not make a smart investment to secure your retirement. He wired the entire principal balance into an unregulated crypto exchange and purchased highly leveraged margin positions on junk digital assets. He essentially took out a massive high-interest loan on your house and took the cash straight to a digital casino." The silence in the conference room was absolute and terrifying. The only sound was Brittany's quiet, hyperventilating sobs as she stared blankly at the mahogany table. "And the truly poetic part of this entire tragedy," I continued, my voice echoing off the glass walls, "is the timing. He executed those massive trades just hours before the global crypto market experienced a catastrophic correction. His positions were liquidated instantly. He lost every single penny of that $1.5 million in less than 48 hours. There is no secret stash of cash. There is no hidden investment account. The money evaporated into thin air, and you are left holding the massive debt on a house you no longer own." Susan let out a loud, agonizing wail. She collapsed back into her chair, covering her face with her trembling hands, as the reality of their absolute ruin finally crushed her. She had spent her entire life judging others for their financial status, looking down on anyone who did not belong to her exclusive country club. And now she was entirely destitute because she had blindly trusted a con artist. Richard stood up so fast his heavy leather chair crashed backward onto the carpet. He lunged across the mahogany table, his face twisted in pure, unadulterated rage, reaching blindly for Jamal's throat. "You son of a bitch!" Richard roared, his booming voice shattering the sophisticated quiet of the law firm. "You stole my house! You stole my life! I am going to kill you!" Jamal scrambled backward, knocking his own chair over as he desperately tried to escape my father's grasp. He threw his hands up, backing himself against the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Boston skyline. "Richard, wait, please." Jamal begged, his voice high and terrified, completely stripped of its false bravado. "We can fix this. I can trade my way out of it. Just give me some time to secure another loan. I know people in the industry. I can get the money back." "You cannot get the money back, Jamal," I said, my voice cutting through their physical altercation like a sharp blade. "Because nobody is going to give a massive loan to a man who is currently the primary target of a federal criminal investigation." Richard froze, his hands still raised aggressively in the air. He looked back at me, his chest heaving, his eyes wild with a mixture of confusion and raw terror. "What do you mean, a federal investigation?" I sat perfectly still, watching the absolute destruction of the family dynamic I had endured for 33 years. "You thought I was just an angry sister trying to prove a point," I said quietly. You thought I invited you to this mediation to yell at you and then hand over the deed out of family loyalty. You severely underestimated me. I did not come here to negotiate. I came here to secure a recorded confession. The words hung in the sterile air of the conference room. A recorded confession. Jamal repeated the phrase, his voice barely a whisper, his eyes darting frantically around the ceiling corners, searching for hidden cameras. He looked at the sleek black speakerphone sitting in the center of the mahogany table, realizing for the first time that the small red light on its base was glowing brightly. "You recorded us?" Jamal choked out, stumbling backward until his spine hit the glass wall. "You set me up." "I did not set you up, Jamal," I replied smoothly. "I simply provided the stage. You wrote the script and performed the play all by yourself." The sheer terror of federal prison finally shattered the last remaining fragments of Jamal's sanity. The primal instinct of self-preservation kicked in. He realized the ship was rapidly sinking into the dark abyss, and he had absolutely no intention of going down alone. He turned his wild, desperate eyes toward his wife. "This is your fault," Jamal screamed, pointing a trembling finger directly at Brittany's face. "You pushed me into this. You and your psychotic obsession with looking rich on the internet." Brittany recoiled as if she had been physically struck. "Excuse me," she shrieked, her voice reaching an ear-piercing pitch. "You are the one who lost $1.5 million in 2 days. You are the one who forged my father's signature. Do not you dare try to blame this on my career." "Your career," Jamal let out a harsh, hysterical laugh that bordered on a sob. "You do not have a career, Brittany. You pose with luxury bags you return the next day. You maxed out 6 different credit cards to buy followers. We were drowning in hundreds of thousands of dollars of your personal debt before I ever even looked at that commercial loan. You told me to do it." Richard and Susan sat frozen in their chairs, their mouths hanging open, as they watched their perfect golden couple tear each other to shreds. Susan reached out a trembling hand. "Please stop it," she cried weakly. "Both of you stop yelling. You are embarrassing the family." "There is no family left to embarrass Susan," Jamal snapped, turning his rage onto my mother. "Do you have any idea what it takes to keep up with your ridiculous country club standards?" Brittany was terrified you would find out we were broke. She told me her father was a clueless old man who had millions just sitting in equity. She gave me his tax returns. She handed me her notary stamp and told me to get the cash so we could buy that vacation home in Aspen and impress you. "You are a liar!" Brittany screamed, her face contorting into an ugly mask of pure hatred. "I never told you to steal the house. I thought you were a legitimate investor. You promised me you were making millions in cryptocurrency. You told me you were going to make me the wife of a billionaire. You are nothing but a pathetic broke loser who cannot even execute a simple trade without losing everything." "I am a loser!" Jamal yelled back, taking a threatening step toward her. "I gave you everything. I leased the Porsche so you could do your stupid steering wheel photos. I paid for the $30,000 country club deposit for this fake anniversary party, using the last bits of cash I could scrape together just so you could pretend you were the perfect daughter. And the moment things go wrong, you sit there and cry like a little victim. Well, I am not going to federal prison for you, Brittany. I am telling the authorities everything. I am giving them your text messages. I will show them exactly how you planned the notary fraud. I will cut a plea deal so fast your head will spin." Brittany snapped. The polished aesthetic influencer persona completely vanished, replaced by a feral, vicious animal. She grabbed her heavy crystal water glass from the table and hurled it directly at Jamal. It missed his head by inches and shattered against the floor-to-ceiling window, sending sparkling shards raining down onto the carpet. "I will testify against you," Brittany shrieked, her chest heaving, tears of absolute rage streaming down her face. "I will tell them you manipulated me. I will tell them you were emotionally abusive and forced me to stamp those papers. I am a young, pretty woman with no criminal record. Who do you think a jury is going to believe? You are going to rot in a cell, Jamal." The conference room had devolved into an absolute madhouse. Richard was clutching his chest, his face pale and slick with cold sweat, looking as though he might go into cardiac arrest. Susan was sobbing hysterically into her hands, rocking back and forth in her chair, murmuring incomprehensible prayers. My corporate attorney sat completely motionless beside me, his hands still folded neatly on the table. He leaned slightly toward me, keeping his voice incredibly low. "I have been practicing corporate litigation for 25 years, he murmured. "I have never seen a self-destruction quite this spectacular." I did not reply. I just sat back and watched the absolute carnage unfold. This was the ultimate psychological payoff. I had spent 33 years watching my parents elevate Brittany onto a pedestal of perfection. I had spent my entire life being told I was the cold, unfeeling disappointment, while she was the warm, loving core of the family. And now, under the bright, unforgiving fluorescent lights of reality, the truth was laid bare for everyone to see. They were not a family built on love or loyalty. They were a syndicate of parasites bound together entirely by greed, ego, and the desperate need to maintain an illusion of superiority. The moment the money evaporated and the threat of real consequences appeared, they turned on each other with the viciousness of starving wolves. Jamal was currently pacing the room, shouting obscenities and listing off every single illegal financial maneuver Brittany had ever asked him to perform. Brittany was screaming over him, calling him a failure, a fraud, and a parasite who had ruined her life. They were giving the federal agents listening in the next room more probable cause than a year of intense interrogations ever could. They were drowning, and instead of trying to save each other, they were actively pushing one another under the water, just to catch a single breath of air. Susan finally slammed her hands down on the mahogany table. Enough, she shrieked, her voice cracking with sheer desperation. She looked wildly from Brittany to Jamal, and then slowly her terrified eyes locked onto me. The fighting stopped. The room grew eerily quiet again, save for the sound of heavy, panicked breathing. My parents had finally realized that watching their golden child and their son-in-law destroy each other was not going to save them from homelessness or federal indictments. There was only one person in the room who had the power to stop the execution, and they were about to make the most delusional, repulsive request of my entire life. "Kendall, please," Susan begged, her voice trembling as she reached across the table, her manicured fingers grazing the edge of the black leather folder. "You have to help us. You are the only one who can fix this." I looked at her, my expression completely impassive. "How exactly do you propose I fix this, Mom? Should I invent a time machine and stop Jamal from committing wire fraud?" "No," Richard interjected, his voice raspy and desperate. He leaned heavily against the table, his previous arrogance entirely extinguished. "You do not need a time machine. You just need to talk to the bank. You own the debt now. You are the creditor. You can call the federal investigators and tell them it was all a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding?" I repeated, raising a single eyebrow. "You want me to tell the FBI that a forged signature, a fraudulent notary stamp, and a $1.5 million offshore wire transfer was a misunderstanding?" "Yes," Susan cried out, tears streaming down her face. "Tell them you authorized the loan. Tell them you gave Jamal permission to use the house as collateral, and that you asked Brittany to notarize it. You can say you were planning to pay it off anyway as a gift to the family. If you say you authorized it, it is no longer a crime. It just becomes a civil dispute over payment terms, and since you own the debt, you can just drop the case." I stared at her, genuinely stunned by the sheer magnitude of her delusion. The absolute audacity of her request hung in the air, heavy and toxic. She was not just asking me to forgive them. She was asking me to commit perjury, to lie to federal agents, and to legally implicate myself in a massive financial conspiracy, all to protect the golden child and her fraudulent husband. "You want me to take the fall?" I said slowly, ensuring every word resonated clearly in the silent room. "You want me to tell the federal government that I am the mastermind behind this massive financial fraud, risking my own freedom, my career, and my entire reputation, so Brittany does not have to face the consequences of her own illegal actions?" "She is your sister," Richard pleaded, his voice breaking. "She is young. She has her whole life ahead of her. She made a mistake, Kendall. If she goes to federal prison, it will destroy her. You are strong, you are successful, you have high-powered lawyers who can negotiate a settlement. You can handle this. She cannot. The room felt incredibly cold. I looked at Richard, then at Susan, and finally at Brittany, who was staring at me with wide, pleading eyes, silently begging me to sacrifice myself upon her altar. For 33 years, this family had demanded that I make myself smaller so Brittany could shine. They had drained my college fund to keep her out of jail for a drunk driving incident. They had expected me to endure constant humiliation and disrespect simply because I was deemed the stronger, more resilient daughter. They believed my independence meant I did not require their love or protection, but rather that I was equipped to absorb their pain. I slowly closed the black leather folder, the heavy thud sounding like a gavel coming down on our relationship. "No," I said, my voice carrying the absolute finality of a closing door. Susan gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Kendall, please, I am begging you. As your mother, I am begging you to save your family." "You are not my family." I stated my words precise and lethal. "You lost the right to call yourselves my family the day you decided my future was entirely expendable. You lost it when you drained my bank account to cover her legal fees. You lost it when you stood in that country club and laughed while Jamal mocked my career. You lost it when you shattered the deed I brought to save you, and you lost it permanently right now by asking me to commit a federal crime to protect a woman who helped steal your home." Richard slammed his fist weakly against the table. "You selfish, ungrateful brat. We gave you everything. You gave me nothing." I fired back, my voice rising just enough to cut through his pathetic anger. "I built my life in spite of you, not because of you. I moved 5,000 miles away to escape this toxic, parasitic dynamic. I came back here with $1.5 million of my own hard-earned money to wipe your slate clean, and you threw it on the floor." I stood up, pushing my chair back. It scraped loudly against the carpet. I looked down at the four of them, feeling absolutely nothing but a profound, liberating emptiness. The heavy chains of obligation and guilt that had tethered me to them my entire life simply dissolved. "I am not taking the fall for this," I continued, my voice perfectly steady. "I am not lying to the federal authorities. I am not dropping the foreclosure. I am not saving you." Jamal forged the documents. Brittany notarized them. And the two of you enabled them every single step of the way, because you were too obsessed with maintaining an illusion of wealth to look at the reality of your own ruin. "Kendall, wait," Brittany sobbed, reaching across the table. "I am sorry. I am so sorry." "Do not apologize to me, Brittany," I said coldly, picking up my briefcase. "Save it for the judge." I turned to my corporate attorney, who had remained entirely silent throughout the entire execution. "Are we finished here?" "We are finished, Miss Kendall," he replied smoothly, gathering his notes and slipping them into his pristine leather bag. I looked at Richard and Susan one last time. They looked broken, aged, and utterly terrified. The grand facade of the wealthy, untouchable Boston family was entirely gone, leaving behind nothing but the pathetic reality of their choices. "You have exactly 72 hours to vacate the property," I informed them, my tone completely devoid of mercy. "If you are not entirely out by Monday morning, the county sheriff will physically remove you. And I strongly suggest you use whatever time you have left to find yourselves some very good criminal defense attorneys." I turned my back on them and walked toward the heavy glass doors of the conference room. I did not look back. I did not need to. The ultimate boundary had been set, the final tie had been severed, and I was walking out of that room a completely free woman. Jamal stared at the glowing red light on the speakerphone. His mind finally caught up to the reality of the trap. He lunged forward, his hands smashing down on the console in a desperate, pathetic attempt to disconnect the call. But it was far too late. The heavy oak doors of the conference room swung open before he could even pull his hands away. Special Agent Reynolds stepped into the room, flanked by 3 armed federal agents wearing tactical vests over their crisp dress shirts. The imposing presence of law enforcement instantly sucked whatever oxygen remained right out of the room. The air conditioning seemed to freeze. Jamal froze, his hands still hovering over the shattered plastic of the speakerphone. Reynolds walked straight toward Jamal, his face a mask of absolute professional authority. He did not yell, he did not draw a weapon. He simply moved with the inevitable force of the federal government. Jamal, you are under arrest for federal wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and conspiracy to commit bank fraud. Reynolds announced, his voice booming with a weight that no fake corporate lawyer could ever replicate. Turn around and place your hands behind your back. Jamal did not fight. The remaining bravado had been entirely drained out of his body. He slowly turned around, placing his hands behind his back as the cold steel handcuffs clicked loudly around his wrists. The sharp metallic sound echoed off the glass walls, a definitive end to his charade of massive wealth and power. As Reynolds began reading him his Miranda rights detailing his right to remain silent, Jamal kept his head down, refusing to look at the family he had just destroyed. Brittany screamed, jumping out of her chair and backing away until she hit the glass wall as another agent approached her. "Ma'am, we need you to step outside with us," the female agent instructed firmly. "You are not currently under arrest, but you are being detained for formal questioning regarding your role in notary fraud and the falsification of legal documents." Brittany looked at our parents with wild, terrified eyes. "Mom! Dad, do something!" She shrieked, her voice cracking as tears ruined her perfectly applied makeup. "Tell them I did not know anything. Call a lawyer. Help me." Susan leaped from her chair, reaching out toward the federal agent. "Wait! Please, you cannot take my daughter!" Susan cried out, her voice breaking. "She is innocent!" "Ma'am, step back immediately," the agent ordered, raising a hand to establish a firm boundary. "If you interfere with a federal investigation, you will be placed in handcuffs as well." Richard grabbed Susan's arm, pulling her back into her seat. They were entirely paralyzed. They sat frozen in their plush leather chairs, watching their golden child being escorted out of the room by federal officers. The perfect daughter, the one who could do no wrong, was being treated like a common criminal, and they had absolutely no power or money to stop it. While the federal agents were marching Jamal and Brittany out of the high-end law firm, an equally devastating scene was unfolding 10 miles away in the affluent suburbs of Boston. At precisely 8 o'clock in the morning, the exact deadline I had set in my eviction notice, two marked police cruisers pulled into the long, circular driveway of my parents' sprawling colonial estate. The county sheriff stepped out of his vehicle holding a clipboard containing the court-ordered writ of possession. He was accompanied by a certified locksmith and a massive crew of professional movers hired by my firm. The pristine neighborhood, usually quiet and serene, was suddenly interrupted by the harsh reality of a forced residential eviction. Neighbors who had attended the lavish anniversary party just a week prior now stood on their manicured lawns watching in hushed, gossiping shock. The sheriff marched up the brick pathway, bypassing the perfectly trimmed flower beds, and knocked loudly on the heavy mahogany front door. When there was no answer, he signaled the locksmith. Within 2 minutes, the heavy brass locks were drilled out and entirely replaced. The house no longer belonged to Richard and Susan. It was officially the legal property of K Holdings. The moving crew worked with ruthless, unfeeling efficiency. They systematically cleared out the designer furniture, the expensive artwork, and the custom wardrobes, packing them into generic cardboard boxes. They carried out Richard's expensive golf clubs and Susan's designer emerald green gowns. They did not care about the curated aesthetic of the living room or the imported Italian marble floors. To them, it was just another defaulted property. The grand illusion of my parents' generational wealth was being boxed up and loaded into a rented moving truck parked unceremoniously on their perfectly manicured lawn. When the house was entirely empty, the sheriff taped a bright orange notice of eviction directly onto the freshly locked front door. The physical displacement was absolute and final. There would be no dramatic return, no last-minute legal maneuvers, and no sympathetic grace period. Back in the conference room, the silence left behind by the arrests was deafening. The federal agents had cleared out, taking my sister and my brother-in-law with them to a holding cell. Only Richard, Susan, my attorney, and I remained. My parents looked like hollow, decaying shells of the arrogant people who had strutted into the room just an hour earlier. Richard was staring blankly at the mahogany table, his hands resting limply in his lap. Susan was quietly weeping, her face buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking with the crushing weight of her entirely shattered reality. I stood up, smoothing the front of my tailored trousers, and picked up the thick black leather folder. I slipped it back into my briefcase, the sharp click of the metal latches echoing sharply in the quiet room. I looked down at the two people who had spent my entire life making me feel like I was a burden, a disappointment, and an outsider. They had finally gotten exactly what they had always given me: absolutely nothing. "I will leave you to arrange your own transportation," I said, my voice perfectly level and devoid of any residual anger. "The sheriff has already changed the locks on the estate, and your personal belongings are being transported to a secure storage facility. The monthly rental fee for the unit has been paid for exactly 30 days. After that, it becomes your financial responsibility." Richard slowly lifted his heavy head. His eyes were bloodshot and filled with a mixture of hatred and absolute soul-crushing defeat. "You destroyed us," he whispered hoarsely. I shook my head, feeling a profound, liberating sense of clarity. "No, Dad. You destroyed yourselves. I just stopped paying the bill to hide the wreckage." I turned and walked out of the conference room, my attorney right beside me. The heavy glass doors swung shut behind us, closing the book on 33 years of toxic manipulation forever. 3 weeks passed since those glass doors swung shut, sealing my past behind them. In Miami, my life returned to its fast-paced, highly structured rhythm. I closed 2 more major acquisitions and enjoyed my evenings watching the ocean from my penthouse balcony. But up in Boston, the harsh, unforgiving winter was setting in, and my family was experiencing a brutal reality check that no amount of country club delusion could fix. When the federal government seizes your assets and freezes your accounts during a major fraud investigation, the descent into poverty is not gradual. It is instantaneous. With Jamal sitting in a federal holding facility awaiting trial and their bank accounts locked down by the authorities, Richard and Susan had absolutely no financial safety net. Their sprawling colonial estate was gone. Their luxury vehicles were repossessed. And the wealthy elite friends they had spent decades impressing vanished overnight. The moment the scandal hit the local news, the country club board convened an emergency meeting and permanently revoked Richard's membership. Susan found herself completely excommunicated from her charity boards and social circles. The women she used to drink vintage champagne with simply blocked her phone number. With no credit, no cash, and their reputations entirely destroyed, they were forced to rent a tiny dilapidated 2-bedroom apartment in a gritty industrial neighborhood on the absolute outskirts of the city. The contrast between their former life and their new reality was stark and punishing. There were no imported Italian marble floors in the new apartment. Instead, the floors were covered in cheap, peeling linoleum that curled at the edges and constantly felt sticky, no matter how many times Susan scrubbed them. There were no vaulted ceilings or custom chandeliers. The low popcorn ceilings were stained with yellow watermarks from a leaking roof illuminated by harsh, flickering fluorescent bulbs. The heating system was a single ancient radiator in the living room that violently clanged and hissed through the night, barely keeping the freezing winter air at bay. The walls were incredibly thin. In their old mansion, they could go days without hearing each other if they wanted privacy. Now they were trapped in a claustrophobic box, forced to listen to every single sound. They could hear the neighbors screaming at each other through the drywall. They could hear the constant wail of police sirens and the rumble of heavy freight trucks shaking the single-pane windows. Richard, a man who once demanded absolute respect and obedience from everyone around him, was reduced to a hollow shell. He spent his days sitting on a cheap second-hand sofa they had found at a thrift store, staring blankly at the stained wall. He had no golf games to attend, no business meetings to command, and no money to manage. The stress had aged him a decade in less than a month. His tailored suits hung loosely on his shrinking frame, completely useless in a neighborhood where wearing a suit only made you a target. He tried to apply for a few consulting jobs to bring in some cash, but a simple background check instantly disqualified him. Nobody wanted to hire a man entangled in a massive federal wire fraud conspiracy. Susan fared no better. The woman who used to spend thousands of dollars a month on spa treatments and designer clothes was now forced to clip coupons and calculate the exact cost of groceries before stepping into a discount supermarket. Her perfect salon blonde hair was growing out, revealing stark gray roots she could not afford to dye. Her manicured nails were chipped and broken from washing dishes by hand in a tiny rusted sink because the apartment did not have a dishwasher. She spent her evenings quietly crying at the small, wobbly kitchen table, mourning the loss of her social status more than she mourned the destruction of her family. And then there was Brittany. The golden child had fallen harder than anyone. While she had managed to avoid immediate jail time by turning state's evidence against Jamal, she was still under intense federal investigation and heavily restricted by a grand jury subpoena. She was entirely trapped in that tiny apartment with the parents she had helped ruin. Her grand aesthetic influencer career had imploded with spectacular public humiliation. The internet is a ruthless place, and it loves nothing more than exposing a hypocrite. When the details of Jamal's arrest and the eviction became public knowledge, Brittany's followers turned on her with vicious speed. The very people she had manipulated into attacking me suddenly realized they had been lied to. Her comment sections were flooded with outrage. Every brand sponsor immediately dropped her issuing public statements, distancing themselves from her fraudulent behavior. Her social media accounts, once her greatest source of pride and income, were entirely deleted to stop the endless barrage of hatred. Now, without her designer clothes, her ring light, or her adoring fans, Brittany was forced to face the ugly reality of who she truly was. She shared a cramped, windowless second bedroom with boxes of whatever cheap belongings they had managed to salvage from the storage unit. She spent her days curled up on a lumpy mattress on the floor, weeping loudly and blaming everyone else for her ruined life. She blamed Jamal for being stupid enough to get caught. She blamed Richard for not having enough real money to bail them out. And she blamed Susan for raising her to believe she was too special to work a real job. The tension inside the small apartment was suffocating. Without money to act as a buffer, their toxic dynamic turned inward, consuming them entirely. Richard and Susan finally saw Brittany, not as the perfect angelic daughter they had always imagined, but as the selfish, manipulative liability she actually was. They resented her for her role in the forgery. She resented them for their sudden poverty. They fought constantly, screaming matches that echoed down the dingy apartment hallway, fighting over trivial things like who left the lights on or who drank the last of the cheap coffee. They had built their entire lives on a foundation of lies, entitlement, and the subjugation of the only daughter who had ever tried to help them. Now that foundation had completely crumbled, burying them in the rubble. They had absolutely nothing left but each other, and they were quickly realizing that being stuck with each other was the greatest punishment of all. While my parents and sister were busy tearing each other apart in their cramped, dilapidated apartment, I was standing in the grand foyer of the estate they used to call home. It was a crisp, clear Tuesday morning in late spring, and the Boston property was officially up for public auction. I stood quietly near the back of the room wearing a tailored charcoal suit, watching as a crowd of wealthy investors and real estate developers aggressively bid against each other. The house, stripped of my parents' pretentious artwork and imported Italian furniture, looked surprisingly empty and devoid of any real warmth. It was just a building, a massive structure of brick, wood, and glass that had served as a fortress for their fragile egos. The auctioneer spoke with rapid, rhythmic precision. The bidding started at the exact amount of the defaulted debt, $1.5 million. But the property was located in one of the most exclusive zip codes in the state, and the price skyrocketed quickly. I watched with clinical detachment as the numbers climbed. 2 million, 2.5 million. Finally, the heavy wooden gavel slammed down on the auction block. Sold, the auctioneer announced, pointing to a developer in the front row, for $2.8 million. The transaction was entirely clean. The $1.5 million went directly back to my firm K Holdings, perfectly balancing the ledger and closing the file on Jamal's massive financial fraud. But that left a surplus of $1.3 million in pure profit. Under normal circumstances, that excess capital would have been absorbed into my personal accounts or reinvested into the corporate portfolio. But I did not want that money. I considered it toxic. It was the physical manifestation of my family's greed, and I refused to let it contaminate the empire I had built with my own hands. Instead, I walked out of the empty colonial estate for the absolute last time, got into the back of my waiting town car, and made a phone call to my wealth management team. I instructed them to take every single penny of that $1.3 million surplus and place it into a newly formed irrevocable trust. By the end of the month, I officially launched the Golden Foundation. It was a nonprofit charity dedicated entirely to providing financial literacy, education, legal representation, and emergency housing funds for women escaping financial abuse and toxic family dynamics. I wanted to create a lifeline for women who were being manipulated by their parents, their partners, or their siblings. Women who were told they were selfish for establishing boundaries. Women who had their college funds drained, their credit scores ruined, or their names forged on legal documents by the very people who were supposed to protect them. The foundation offered them the ultimate armor against manipulation, which is absolute financial independence. I took the money my family tried to steal to maintain their fake country club lifestyle, and I used it to fund the escape plans of women who actually needed it. It was the most satisfying investment I had ever made in my entire career. A few months later, the dust had completely settled. Jamal was formally indicted by a federal grand jury and was facing a minimum of 10 years in a maximum security facility. Brittany was working a minimum wage retail job, her wages heavily garnished by the courts to pay off her massive credit card debts, still trapped in that miserable two-bedroom apartment with our parents. They had completely vanished from my world, existing only as a cautionary tale about the destructive power of unchecked entitlement. I stood on the expansive balcony of my Miami penthouse, the warm, salty ocean breeze gently blowing through my hair. The sun was beginning its slow descent over the horizon, painting the Florida sky in vibrant shades of deep purple and brilliant orange. The city below was alive with energy, a sprawling metropolis of ambition and opportunity. I walked over to the outdoor marble bar and picked up a heavy crystal decanter, pouring myself a generous glass of an incredibly rare vintage red wine. I took my glass and walked over to a small custom-built display case resting on a side table near the edge of the balcony. Inside the clear glass casing was not a prestigious corporate award or a photograph of a milestone business acquisition. It was a jagged, torn piece of heavy gold wrapping paper. It was the exact piece of paper that had covered the $1.5 million deed, the gift they had shoved off the table at their anniversary party. I had asked the busboy to save it for me before I left the country club that night, knowing even then that it would eventually become the most important souvenir of my life. I looked at the torn gold foil, taking a slow, appreciative sip of my wine. The rich, complex flavors coated my palate as I looked out over the endless expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. For 33 years, I had allowed society to convince me that family was an unbreakable bond, a mandatory obligation dictated entirely by blood and genetics. I had believed that I owed them my silence, my money, and my sanity simply because we shared a last name. But standing here now, surrounded by the absolute peace of a life I had entirely built and fiercely protected, I finally understood the truth. Family is not blood. Blood is nothing more than a biological coincidence. Family is respect. Family is the people who celebrate your independence, who honor your boundaries, and who never ask you to set yourself on fire just to keep them warm. They had thrown my gift on the floor because they thought my money was dirty. They thought I was a ruthless corporate vulture who only cared about the bottom line. But the irony was, I had brought them the greatest gift a daughter could ever offer: a clean slate. They chose their ego over their salvation. And in doing so, they handed me the ultimate victory. I did not just win the property, I won my absolute freedom. I raised my crystal glass to the torn gold paper, offering a silent final toast to the family I had left behind in the wreckage of their own making. I took one last sip, turned my back to the setting sun, and walked inside my beautiful, quiet home. The greatest lesson I learned is that financial independence is the ultimate armor against manipulation. Society conditions us to believe sharing DNA means enduring endless disrespect. But blood is just biology. True family is built on mutual respect and healthy boundaries. When you build your own empire, Nobody can use guilt to control your narrative. You hold the power to walk away from tables where respect is no longer served. Establishing firm boundaries is painful, but entirely necessary for your peace. Have you ever had to cut ties with a toxic relative? Please share your stories in the comments below.